The sound of my mother's laughter through the kitchen door should have been warm. Instead, it cut through me like glass. "Don't worry, Claire. Your foolish sister will pay for everything like always. She's been our little ATM for 10 years, she won't stop now." I stood frozen in the hallway, clutching the coffee mug that suddenly felt too heavy in my hands. 10 years. 10 years of funding Claire's dreams, while mine gathered dust. College tuition car payments, designer clothes, cosmetic surgery, all paid for by me, while I lived in a cramped apartment working 70-hour weeks. And now they wanted me to fund a $50,000 wedding. A wedding I wasn't even invited to attend. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. When they asked me to handle the vendors, I smiled and said yes. When they demanded I coordinate all the payments, I nodded eagerly. When Claire bragged to everyone about her generous sister funding her fairy tale, I played my part perfectly. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't served cold, it's served at exactly the moment when 200 wedding guests are standing in an empty hall, wondering where the tables went, where the flowers disappeared, why there's no music, no food, no ceremony. Just my mother screaming my name into the void while her precious Claire stands there in a $3,000 dress with nowhere to wear it. And me, I'm 3,000 miles away on a Hawaiian beach, watching my phone light up with 110 missed calls, finally understanding what freedom tastes like. The real show was just beginning. My name is Stephanie Collins, and at 28 years old, I'd built a successful career as a project manager at one of Denver's top construction firms. I'd worked my way up from an entry-level coordinator putting in 60-hour weeks and earning the respect of contractors twice my age. What I hadn't managed to build was a backbone when it came to my own family. The coffee mug trembled in my hands as I stood frozen outside our family's living room, my mother's voice carrying through the slightly open door with crystal clarity. I'd only stopped by to drop off the spare key to my apartment. Mom had been watering my plants while I was on a business trip to Phoenix. I never expected to become an unwitting audience to a conversation that would shatter what was left of my illusions about family love. "Don't you worry about a thing, Claire." Mom's voice dripped with the kind of warmth she'd never used when talking about me. "Your foolish sister will pay for everything like always. She's been doing it for 10 years now, college, that car, your apartment deposit, even that nose job you just had to have. Claire deserves a perfect wedding, and Stephanie knows her place in this family." The bitter laugh that followed felt like a physical blow. I pressed my back against the hallway wall, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. But Mom continued, oblivious to my presence. "50,000 might seem like a lot, but you know how she is. She'll grumble a bit, maybe ask a few questions, but in the end she'll write the checks. She always does. That's what the responsible one is for after all." The mug slipped from my numb fingers, but I caught it just before it crashed to the hardwood floor. Responsible. That's what I was to them. Not daughter, not sister, not even person, just the responsible one. The one who paid the bills while they lived their dreams. 10 years of memories crashed over me like a tsunami. Claire's tearful phone call when she was 19 begging me to help with her college tuition because she'd spent her savings on spring break in Cancun. "Just this once, Stephanie. I promise I'll pay you back." She never did. The countless times Mom had casually mentioned Claire's car payment was due. Her rent was late. Her credit card was maxed out, always with that expectant look that said I was supposed to step in and fix everything. I thought about my own college years, working 2 jobs while taking classes, eating ramen noodles for dinner while sending money home to help with family expenses, that somehow never seemed to benefit me. I remembered turning down promotions that required travel because the family needs you close, Stephanie. I thought about the dozens of dates I'd canceled because Claire had some crisis that required my immediate financial intervention. All those years I'd told myself it was love. That being needed meant being loved. That my worth to this family came from my willingness to sacrifice everything for them. Standing in that hallway, listening to my mother discuss me like I was nothing more than an ATM with legs, I finally understood the truth. They didn't love me. They needed me. And there's a universe of difference between the two. I could hear Claire's voice now, younger and more excited than usual. Oh, Mom, I can't wait. Eric is going to be so impressed with the venue. 200 guests, those gorgeous white roses, everywhere the string quartet during the ceremony. It's going to be everything I've ever dreamed of. And your sister will make sure every penny is covered, Mom replied. She owes you that much after all. You've had to live in her shadow long enough watching her get all the career success while you struggled. It's time she paid you back for all those years. My shadow. I wanted to laugh, but the sound that almost escaped was more like a sob. Claire had struggled because she'd never worked a day in her life, content to float from one part-time job to another while I covered her expenses. She'd lived in my shadow because shadows are cast by people who actually stand in the light and work for what they have. But as I stood there feeling smaller and more invisible than I ever had before, something shifted inside me. The hurt began to crystallize into something harder, sharper, more dangerous. They thought they knew me so well, thought they could predict exactly how I'd react when Claire called with her wedding plans, when Mom presented me with the vendor quotes, when they all looked at me with those expectant faces that had controlled my life for a decade. They were wrong. This time, when they came to me with their hands out and their demands disguised as loving requests, I would say yes. I would agree to everything they wanted. I would be the responsible sister, the dutiful daughter, the reliable ATM they'd always counted on. But I would be all of those things in exactly the way they deserved. If they wanted my wallet, they'd have to walk straight into my trap first. The memories hit me like a physical force as I finally stepped away from that door, each one a fresh wound reopening. It had all started so innocently when I was 18, clutching my acceptance letter to Colorado State University, along with the full academic scholarship that represented 4 years of freedom. I remember the pride in my voice when I called home breathless with excitement about my future in architecture, about finally having a path that was mine alone. Mom's response should have been my first warning. That's wonderful, sweetheart, but you know Claire's having such a hard time getting into anywhere decent. Her grades weren't quite good enough for scholarships. There was a pause, the kind that always preceded a request I couldn't refuse. What if you went to community college instead, just for the first 2 years? We could use your scholarship money to help Claire get into that private college she's been dreaming about. You're so much smarter than she is, you'll do well anywhere. The conversation that followed is burned into my memory like a brand. Claire crying about how unfair it was that I got everything while she struggled. Dad saying nothing as usual, just nodding along with whatever Mom decided was best. And me, 18, and desperate to be the good daughter, the one who put family first, agreeing to give up my scholarship and my dreams so Claire could have hers. I spent the next 2 years at Denver Community College working nights at a grocery store and weekends at a coffee shop watching my savings account drain as fast as I could fill it. Claire, meanwhile, was living her best life at Regis University, joining sororities and taking spring break trips to Mexico while I calculated whether I could afford both textbooks and groceries in the same week. The car came next, of course. Claire was 21 and had decided she absolutely needed a Honda Civic to maintain her image on campus. "Stephanie, you're so practical," Mom had said during one of our weekly phone calls. "You know how important it is for Claire to fit in. She can't keep borrowing her roommate's car forever. It's embarrassing." The unspoken message was clear: I was the practical one, which meant I was the one who solved problems with money. So I took out a loan for $8,000, co-signed the paperwork, and watched Claire drive off in her shiny new car while I continued taking the bus to my 2 jobs and night classes. For 3 years I stood at bus stops in Denver winters, my hands numb with cold, while my sister complained about having to pay for her own gas. The apartment deposit was the next logical step in this twisted family dance. Claire had graduated and decided she wanted to live in one of those trendy low-do lofts, the kind with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that cost more per month than I was making in 6 weeks. "It's just the deposit, Stephanie. $3,000. I'll pay you back as soon as I find a job." But finding a job required actually looking for one, and Claire was too busy enjoying her post-graduation freedom to bother with employment. I borrowed against my credit card and wrote the check, then went back to my cramped room in a boarding house near downtown where I shared a bathroom with 4 other tenants and pretended not to hear the couple next door fighting every night. The cosmetic surgery was when I should have drawn the line. Claire had decided her nose wasn't perfect enough for the marketing career she was half-heartedly pursuing. Everyone gets work done these days, Stephanie. It's an investment in my future. You wouldn't want me to struggle because I don't feel confident about my appearance, would you? I remember sitting in my dentist's office that same week being told I needed a root canal that would cost $1,200. I remember calling to reschedule, then reschedule again, then finally just avoiding the dentist altogether as my tooth began to ache constantly. Instead, I took out another loan and paid for Claire's nose job, then spent the next 6 months managing my pain with over-the-counter medication and hoping the problem would somehow resolve itself. It never did resolve itself, of course. None of it did. The requests just kept coming, each one presented as a temporary emergency, a one-time favor, a chance for me to prove how much I loved my family. My work week stretched longer and longer as I climbed the ladder in construction management, but instead of my life getting easier, it got more complicated. 60 hours became 70 hours, became whatever it took to earn enough to keep everyone else afloat. I sent home 60% of everything I earned, living on the remainder like a college student well into my 20s. While my colleagues went out for drinks after work, I went home to my studio apartment and calculated how much I could afford to send home this month. While they dated and traveled and bought themselves nice things, I fielded phone calls about Claire's credit card bills and Mom's unexpected medical expenses, and always found a way to say yes. The men who asked me out eventually stopped asking. How do you explain that you can't go to dinner because your sister needs her car payment covered? How do you tell someone you can't take a weekend trip because your mother's expecting her monthly check? It was easier to just stay home to become the reliable daughter, the responsible sister, the family's financial backbone who existed solely to support everyone else's dreams. I had learned to fund their dreams, now I would fund my escape. The call came 2 days later. Claire's voice practically vibrating with excitement through my phone speaker as I sat in my office reviewing blueprints for a new shopping center project. I should have known something was coming. Claire never called during business hours unless she needed something, and the breathless quality of her voice told me this was going to be expensive. Stephanie, oh my God, I have the most incredible news, she squealed, and I could practically see her bouncing on her toes the way she had since childhood whenever she wanted something. I'm engaged. Eric proposed last night at that fancy restaurant downtown. You know, the one with the rooftop terrace. It was so romantic, Stephanie. There were candles everywhere, and he got down on one knee and everyone in the restaurant was watching and clapping. I felt like a princess. I set down my pen and leaned back in my chair, already calculating in my head what this was going to cost me. That's wonderful, Claire. Congratulations. Eric seems like a nice guy. I'd only met him twice, brief encounters at family dinners where he'd spent more time asking about my job and salary than getting to know me as a person. But Claire was so smitten, I'd kept my observations to myself. He's perfect, Stephanie, absolutely perfect. And we're thinking a spring wedding, maybe April or May when the weather's nice. I've already been looking at venues. There's this gorgeous place in Cherry Creek. It's like something out of a fairy tale with crystal chandeliers and marble floors, and these massive windows that overlook the mountains. Her words tumbled over each other in her excitement, and I found myself getting caught up despite my wariness. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time I'd just be the sister, not the financier. How many people are you thinking? I asked, genuinely curious about her vision. Well, that's the thing. Eric's family is huge, like massive, and they're all so close. And then there's all our friends from college and Mom's church group and the people from Eric's work. We're thinking around 200 guests, maybe 250 if we can manage it. I want everyone we love to be there to celebrate with us. The number hit me like a punch to the stomach. 200 guests meant an expensive venue, expensive catering, expensive everything. I tried to keep my voice neutral. That sounds like it's going to be quite an event. Have you started looking at budgets? There was a pause, and I heard that telltale change in her voice. the shift from excited to carefully casual that I'd learned to recognize over the years. Well, you know how these things go. The venue alone is about $15,000, and that's just for the day of rental. Then there's catering, we're thinking seated dinner, not just cocktails and appetizers, and that's running about $25,000 for the guest count we want. And flowers. Oh, Stephanie, you should see the arrangements I've been looking at. White roses and peonies, just gorgeous, but quality flowers are so expensive. And music, we want a live band, not just a DJ, because this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. I could feel the familiar knot forming in my stomach, the one that appeared whenever these conversations started heading toward their inevitable conclusion. How much are we talking about total? Well, she drew the word out, and I knew she was working up the courage to drop the number. With everything we want. The dress, the photographer, the videographer, the flowers, the cake from that bakery, everyone raves about. We're looking at maybe $50,000. I know it sounds like a lot, but Stephanie, this is my wedding. My one chance to have the perfect day I've been dreaming about since I was little. $50,000. More than I'd paid for my car. More than I had in my savings account. More than most people spent on anything except a house. I felt dizzy. That's definitely a significant investment, I managed to say. How are you and Eric planning to handle the financing? Another pause longer this time. Well, Eric's still getting his business off the ground, you know how it is with startups. And I'm between jobs right now, just trying to figure out my next career move. But we figured with your new promotion and everything, and you've always been so generous with family. The request hung in the air between us, unspoken but crystal clear. I found myself nodding, even though she couldn't see me the familiar pattern of giving in before she'd even finished asking. Of course I'll help however I can, I heard myself saying. When are you thinking of having the ceremony? Oh, thank you, Stephanie, I knew you'd understand. We're thinking late March, early April. I'll send you all the vendor information so you can coordinate with them directly. It'll be so much easier if you handle all the payment arrangements. Something in her phrasing made me pause. Send me information to coordinate. What do you mean? Well, you know, for making deposits and final payments and all that business stuff. You're so much better with vendors and contracts and things. A cold feeling started spreading through my chest. Claire, where exactly will I be during all this coordination? I mean, what time should I plan to arrive at the venue on the wedding day? The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone small and uncertain. Oh, Stephanie, I thought you understood. You'll be so busy that day handling all the vendor payments and making sure everything goes smoothly. Plus, you know how it is with venue capacity, they're really strict about the guest count, and with Eric's family being so large and all our friends, I mean, you'll practically be running the whole event anyway. You'll be way too busy to actually sit through the ceremony. The words hit me like ice water. Too busy to attend my own sister's wedding because I'd be paying for it. Not a guest, just a sponsor. Not family, just a financial resource to be managed and utilized. I see, I said quietly. You understand, right? I mean, you've never been much for parties anyway, and someone needs to handle all the logistics. You're so good at that stuff. I understood perfectly. I understood that I'd spent 10 years believing that love looked like sacrifice, that family meant putting everyone else's needs before my own, that being needed was the same as being valued. I understood that I'd been wrong about all of it. I understand completely, Claire. After I hung up, I sat in my office as the late afternoon sun slanted through my windows, feeling something fundamental shift inside me. If I wasn't going to be a guest, I certainly wasn't going to be a host either. The formal introduction to Eric came the following Sunday at our weekly family dinner, a tradition Mom had insisted on maintaining even after Claire and I had moved out. I'd been dreading it since Claire's phone call, knowing that meeting the man who'd inspired a $50,000 wedding would require more acting skills than I possessed. But as I sat across from him at Mom's dining room table, watching him work his charm on my family, I realized I wasn't the only one putting on a performance. Eric was undeniably handsome in that polished corporate way that photographed well on LinkedIn profiles. He had the kind of confident smile that made people want to trust him immediately, and he wielded it like a weapon as he complimented Mom's pot roast and asked Dad thoughtful questions about his work at the hardware store. But it was when he turned that megawatt smile on me that I felt the first prickle of unease. "Stephanie Claire has told me so much about you," he said, extending his hand across the table with practiced ease. "I have to say, I'm incredibly impressed. Project manager at Morrison Construction. That's a serious position. Claire mentioned you've been there, 6 years now, working your way up from coordinator to management level. That takes real dedication and intelligence." The compliments felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced them in the mirror. More telling was the way his eyes sharpened when he mentioned my job title, the subtle shift in his posture that suggested he was filing away information for later use. "Thank you," I replied carefully. "It's been a good opportunity to grow professionally." "I bet it has. Construction management, especially in Denver's market right now, that must be incredibly lucrative. I mean, with all the development happening downtown and in the suburbs, companies like Morrison must be pulling in massive contracts." He leaned forward slightly, his interest seeming genuine to everyone else at the table, but feeling calculated to me. "You must be doing very well for yourself." Claire beamed at him like he'd just solved world hunger. "Isn't he sweet? He's so interested in everyone's careers. Eric's starting his own consulting business, aren't you, honey?" "Just getting it off the ground," Eric said with what I was beginning to recognize as false modesty. "Still in the investment phase, you know how it is. But enough about me, Stephanie. I'm curious about the residential market. Claire mentioned you've been looking at investment properties." I nearly choked on my water. I had never mentioned investment properties to Claire, mostly because I'd never had enough money left over after funding her lifestyle to invest in anything. "I think there might be some confusion," I said slowly. "Oh, maybe I misunderstood," Eric said smoothly, but his eyes remained locked on mine. "Claire was telling me about your financial planning, how responsible you are with money. She mentioned you've been incredibly generous with family over the years. That kind of financial stability is rare in someone our age." The way he said "our age" made me realize he was probably older than Claire had mentioned. There were fine lines around his eyes that suggested he was closer to my age than hers, maybe even older. But Claire was gazing at him with such adoration that I doubted she'd noticed or cared. "Family helps family," I said the familiar phrase, tasting bitter in my mouth. "Exactly." Eric's smile broadened. "That's such a beautiful philosophy. Claire is so lucky to have a sister who understands the importance of family support. Good thing she has such a generous sister, right? Especially with wedding costs these days, they can be astronomical." The comment landed like a probe testing my reaction. I felt like a specimen under a microscope being examined for signs of financial weakness or strength. He wasn't making conversation. He was conducting an assessment. Dad, oblivious to the undercurrents, nodded approvingly. "Stephanie's always been the responsible one. Never asks for anything, always helping out." "I can see that," Eric said, and for just a moment his smile slipped into something colder, more calculating. "Claire's lucky to have that kind of security in her family." The rest of dinner passed in a blur of Eric asking carefully crafted questions about my work schedule, my living situation, my car payments. He never asked directly about my salary or savings, but he managed to extract a surprising amount of financial information through seemingly innocent conversation. By the time we were clearing plates, he probably had a better sense of my budget than my accountant did. That night, something nagged at me as I replayed the evening. Eric's interest had felt too focused, too strategic. Men who were genuinely interested in getting to know their future sister-in-law didn't typically spend dinner calculating her net worth. So I did what any suspicious woman in the digital age does. I Googled him. Eric Matthew Jennings, 32. Previously lived in Phoenix and Seattle. What I found in those search results made my blood run cold. 2 engagement announcements in different cities' newspaper archives. Both women appeared to be around Claire's age, both from families with money, and both had older sisters mentioned prominently in the wedding planning articles as generous family supporters. The first engagement had been called off abruptly after a year of planning shortly after the bride's family experienced financial difficulties. The second had ended when the bride's sister moved across the country, taking her financial support with her. In both cases, Eric had disappeared from their social media and moved to a new city within months of the broken engagements. I dug deeper, cross-referencing dates and locations, following digital breadcrumbs through Facebook posts and Instagram stories. The pattern was unmistakable. Eric didn't fall in love with women, he researched them. He found young, attractive women from families with money, specifically families with successful older siblings who had a history of financial generosity. He courted the sister, charmed the family, and positioned himself to access resources that weren't technically his. Claire wasn't his bride, she was his business plan, and I wasn't the generous sister he was courting. I was the target he was hunting. He had his harvest planned, but I had my drought ready. The Monday morning after that revealing dinner, I threw myself into work with unusual intensity, desperate to focus on something that made sense in a world where nothing else seemed to. The Riverside Commons renovation project had been my baby for 6 months, a historic office building being converted into mixed-use retail and residential space. And today we were meeting with the architect who'd be handling the structural modifications for the upper floors. Michael Torres arrived at the construction trailer precisely on time, carrying rolled blueprints under one arm and a coffee that smelled infinitely better than the bitter brew from our ancient office machine. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through it while studying plans, and when he shook my hand, his grip was firm without being aggressive, professional without being distant. "You must be Stephanie Collins," he said. And I was immediately struck by how he looked directly at me when he spoke, not over my shoulder or around the room, like so many contractors did when they met a female project manager. "I've been looking forward to working with you. I reviewed your preliminary reports last week. Your assessment of the load-bearing issues on the 3rd floor was spot on. That kind of attention to structural detail isn't something you see every day." It was such a simple compliment, focused entirely on my professional competence, but it caught me off guard. When was the last time someone had praised my work without immediately segueing into what they needed from me personally? We spent the morning going over architectural plans, discussing timeline constraints and budget parameters, and I found myself genuinely enjoying the collaborative process. Michael listened to my concerns about coordinating with the electrical and plumbing subcontractors, offered practical solutions for the ventilation challenges in the basement level, and never once made me feel like I was being difficult when I pushed back on elements that could create problems down the line. It was during our lunch break, sitting on folding chairs outside the construction trailer with sandwiches from the deli down the street, that the conversation shifted from professional to personal, in a way that felt completely natural. "So, how did you end up in construction management?" Michael asked, unwrapping what looked like a turkey and avocado sandwich made with actual fresh bread instead of the processed stuff I usually grabbed from convenience stores. It's not exactly a traditional path for most people. I found myself telling him about discovering my love for problem-solving during a college internship, about the satisfaction of seeing a project transform from blueprints to reality, about the challenge of coordinating dozens of moving parts into a cohesive whole. As I talked, I realized I was describing parts of my job I'd forgotten. I enjoyed aspects of my career that had gotten buried under the constant stress of family financial management. "That's fascinating," he said, and seemed to actually mean it. "What got you interested in the first place? Were you one of those kids who built elaborate Lego cities?" The question made me laugh, a real laugh that surprised me with its spontaneity. "Actually, yes. I used to spend hours creating these detailed architectural plans for imaginary buildings. I wanted to be an architect originally, before I switched to business management." "What changed your mind?" The answer stuck in my throat. How could I explain that I'd given up my dream to fund someone else's? That I'd chosen a more immediately lucrative career path because my family needed money more than I needed personal fulfillment, life circumstances, I said finally. Sometimes practical considerations have to take priority over personal interests. Michael nodded thoughtfully, but something in his expression suggested he heard the sadness I was trying to hide. Do you still draw sketch building designs, I mean? The question hit me unexpectedly. When was the last time I'd picked up a pencil for anything other than signing checks or filling out vendor forms? I don't really have time for hobbies anymore, I said automatically, the response so practiced it came out without conscious thought. Everyone has time for something they love, Michael said gently. Maybe not hours every day, but something. What do you do when you want to relax? When you're not managing projects or dealing with contractors? I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't have one. My evenings were spent reviewing family financial requests, my weekends absorbed by Claire's crises or Mom's expectations. Even my vacation days were typically consumed by family obligations that couldn't wait. I help my family, I said, aware of how pathetic it sounded. That's generous of you, but what do you do for yourself? The question hung in the air between us, and I felt a strange panic rising in my chest. What did I do for myself? When was the last time I'd made a decision based solely on what would make me happy? When was the last time someone asked what you wanted? Michael continued, his voice soft but insistent. Not what your family needs, not what your job requires, not what would be practical or responsible, what you actually want for yourself. I stared at him, this relative stranger who was asking questions no one in my family had bothered with in years. The intensity of his attention was almost overwhelming. He was looking at me like I was a person with opinions and desires and dreams that mattered, not just a resource to be tapped when needed. I'm not sure I remember. I admitted, the honesty slipping out before I could stop it. Then maybe it's time to figure that out, he said simply. For the first time in years, someone saw me as a person, not a bank account. The following weekend, when I arrived for our usual Sunday dinner, Dad was waiting by the front window like he'd been watching for my car. This wasn't entirely unusual. He'd always been the one to greet me first, offering to carry whatever I'd brought or help with my coat. But something about his posture seemed different. More alert, more purposeful than his typical gentle hovering. "Hey there, kiddo," he said as I walked up the front steps using the nickname he'd called me since childhood but hadn't used in months. His weathered hands, permanently stained from years of working at the hardware store, fidgeted with the dish rag he was holding. "You look different today. Good different, I mean. Like you got some rest or something?" I paused, surprised by the observation. Dad wasn't typically one for commentary about appearances or moods. That was Mom's territory. He was more of a quiet presence, the one who fixed leaky faucets and changed oil in cars, and nodded along with whatever decisions the women in the family made. "I've been sleeping better lately," I said, which was true. Since my lunch conversation with Michael, I'd found myself actually looking forward to parts of my day, instead of just enduring them. It was amazing how much better rest came when you weren't constantly dreading the next financial emergency phone call. Dad studied my face with an intensity that caught me off guard. "You seem more yourself somehow. Like the Stephanie I remember from when you were in high school before." He trailed off, his eyes shifting away from mine in that familiar pattern of avoidance I'd grown up watching. Before what I wanted to ask, but Mom's voice carried from the kitchen calling us in for dinner, and the moment passed. Still, as we walked through the familiar hallway lined with family photos, I caught Dad glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It reminded me of the way he used to look when he was trying to work up the courage to ask Mom if we could afford something, part hope, part resignation, part fear of the inevitable rejection. Dinner conversation followed its predictable pattern, with Mom orchestrating the discussion like a conductor leading a familiar symphony. Claire dominated the conversation with wedding updates, Eric charming everyone with practiced ease, and me nodding along while mentally calculating costs. But I noticed Dad watching me during these exchanges, his fork pausing midway to his mouth when I failed to show the expected enthusiasm for Claire's latest vendor selection or venue modification. When Claire launched into her description of the upgraded floral package she'd selected, "It's only $3,000 more than the original quote, But Stephanie, you should see these centerpieces. They're absolutely stunning. I simply nodded and said, "That sounds lovely." No immediate agreement to cover the additional cost. No automatic reassurance that money wasn't an issue, just polite acknowledgement. Dad's eyes sharpened at my response, or rather at what I didn't say. He'd been present for enough of these conversations over the years to recognize the deviation from script. Usually by this point in the discussion, I'd be asking about payment schedules and vendor contact information. It was after dinner when Mom and Claire had disappeared into the living room to look at wedding magazines, and Eric had stepped outside to take a business call that Dad made his move. He found me in the kitchen loading dishes into the dishwasher with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this exact task 1,000 times. "Stephanie," he said quietly, positioning himself between me and the living room doorway, like he was creating a barrier against interruption. His voice carried a weight I wasn't accustomed to hearing from him. "About this wedding business. All these expenses Claire keeps mentioning." He cleared his throat awkwardly, the sound of a man unaccustomed to broaching difficult topics. "You don't have to. If it's too much of a burden." The words hung in the air between us, and I could see the effort it had taken him to even get that much out. Dad had never been one for confrontation or difficult conversations. He was a fixer of tangible problems, broken appliances, squeaky hinges, cars that wouldn't start, not complex family dynamics or emotional issues. "Dad, what are you trying to say?" I asked, gently setting down the plate I'd been rinsing. He opened his mouth to continue, but before he could form the words, Mom's voice cut through the kitchen like a blade. "Robert, what are you doing in there? Come look at these dress designs Claire found. We need your opinion on the father-daughter dance song." The interruption was perfectly timed, as if she'd been listening from the other room and sensed the direction our conversation was heading. Dad's shoulders sagged in defeat, and I saw 28 years of similar moments flash across his features, all the times he'd started to speak up, started to question, started to protect, only to be redirected by Mom's stronger will. "Coming, honey," he called back, but his eyes remained fixed on mine for another moment, filled with something that looked like an apology. "We'll talk later," I said quietly, though we both knew we wouldn't. Later never came in our family when it came to uncomfortable truths. But as he walked toward the living room, Dad paused in the doorway and turned back to me. "You know you were going to be an architect once," he said, his voice so low I almost missed it. "You had all those drawings, those building plans you used to show me. You were so excited about designing spaces where people could be happy." He was quiet for a long moment. "I've wondered sometimes what happened to that girl." The observation hit me like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. He'd been watching all these years, noticing what I'd lost, even when I'd stopped noticing it myself. He'd seen me transform from a girl with dreams into a woman whose primary function was writing checks for other people's happiness. After he disappeared into the living room, I stood alone in the kitchen, my hands still wet from dish soap, processing the weight of what had just happened. Dad had tried to give me an out, tried to acknowledge that maybe the family had asked too much of me. It was the first crack I'd ever seen in the solid wall of expectation that surrounded me. He knew something was shifting, but he didn't know his daughter was planning an earthquake. The formal summons came 3 days later in the form of Mom's most authoritative voice on my voicemail. "Stephanie, we need to have a proper family meeting this Sunday after dinner. Claire and Eric will be there, and we have important wedding planning to discuss. Don't be late." The tone left no room for interpretation. This wasn't a request, it was a command performance where my attendance was mandatory and my compliance was assumed. When I arrived that Sunday, the dining room had been transformed into a war room. Mom had covered the table with spreadsheets, vendor brochures, and what appeared to be a timeline chart with color-coded sections. Claire sat at one end with a thick binder labeled Dream Wedding in gold script, while Eric occupied the chair across from me looking like a businessman about to close a major deal. Dad hovered near the kitchen doorway, clearly uncomfortable with the formal atmosphere but unwilling to challenge it. "Now that we're all here," Mom began adjusting her reading glasses with the air of a general addressing her troops. It's time to get serious about Claire's wedding. This is going to be the event of the season, and we need to make sure every detail is perfect. She lifted the first spreadsheet with ceremony. I've broken down all the costs into categories so we can see exactly what we're working with. The budget presentation was indeed military in its precision. Mom had researched every vendor, compared prices, and created what looked like a corporate financial projection. The venue rental at Bella Vista Gardens is $25,000 for the day, which includes the ceremony space, reception hall, and bridal suite. The catering is $15,000 for 200 guests with the premium menu selection. We're not cutting corners on food quality. Flowers are $3,000 for the ceremony arrangements, centerpieces, and bridal bouquet from Petals and Pearls. Photography and videography together are $4,500 from that award-winning studio Claire found. As she continued down the list, each item presented like an unavoidable necessity. Rather than a choice, I found myself genuinely impressed by the thoroughness of her research. She'd clearly spent weeks on this presentation, gathering quotes and creating justifications for every expense. The band was $3,500 because live music creates atmosphere you simply can't get from a DJ. The cake was $1,800 because the cake-cutting photos will be treasured forever. The wedding dress alterations were $500 because Claire deserves to look absolutely perfect. In total, Mom concluded, setting down the final page with satisfaction, we're looking at $52,300 for everything Claire needs for her perfect day. We know we can count on you, Stephanie. You've always been there for this family when it matters most. The assumption in that statement was breathtaking in its completeness. Not, would you be willing to help? Not, can we discuss how to handle these costs? But simply, we know we can count on you. My agreement wasn't being requested, it was being taken for granted like a natural law of physics. This is quite comprehensive, I said, accepting the folder Mom handed me with all the vendor information. You've clearly put a lot of work into this planning. Claire and I have been researching for months, Mom replied proudly. We wanted to make sure we had all the facts before we presented this to you. No surprises, no hidden costs, everything transparent and organized. I nodded thoughtfully, flipping through pages of vendor contracts and price quotes while my family watched expectantly. What's the timeline for deposits and final payments? I asked, pulling out my phone as if to check my calendar for payment scheduling. Most deposits are due within 2 weeks of booking. Eric chimed in, consulting his own notes. Final payments are typically due 7 to 10 days before the event. I can coordinate with vendors if you'd like to set up a payment schedule. That would be helpful, I replied, making notes in my phone. What about vendor communications? Will there be site visits, tastings, final confirmations closer to the date? Claire practically bounced in her seat. Oh yes, there's a cake tasting next month and we need to do a final walkthrough at the venue 2 weeks before. Plus all the little details like confirming delivery times and setup schedules. It might be easier if I handle all the vendor communications directly, I suggested, still appearing to study the paperwork. That way there's one point of contact for everything, no confusion about who's responsible for what arrangements. The relief that washed over their faces was almost comical. Mom's shoulders visibly relaxed. Eric nodded approvingly and Claire clapped her hands together like I'd just offered to solve world hunger. That's perfect, Stephanie, Mom said. You're so much better at handling business details than the rest of us. We'll just focus on the fun, creative aspects while you manage all the practical arrangements. I'll need all the vendor contact information, I said, accepting another folder from Mom. Email addresses, phone numbers, contract terms. I want to make sure I understand exactly what we're committing to with each vendor. Everything's in there, Mom assured me. I've organized it alphabetically by vendor type. You'll find Claire and Eric are remarkably easy to work with. They trust your judgment completely. Over the next hour, I asked detailed questions about guest count confirmations, dietary restrictions, setup requirements, and contingency plans. My family interpreted my methodical approach as evidence of my commitment to making their vision reality. They saw careful planning where I was actually mapping out the perfect disaster. When I agreed to be the primary liaison with every vendor to handle all deposits and final payments to coordinate every detail of their elaborate celebration, they thought they were witnessing my surrender to family obligation. What they were actually witnessing was me taking complete control of their wedding in a way that would give me absolute power over its success or failure. Every yes was another lock on their cage. 2 weeks after accepting my role as wedding coordinator, I found myself sitting in a mortgage broker's office, finally ready to take the step I'd been postponing for years, buying my own home. The conversation with Michael about what I wanted for myself had planted a seed that was rapidly growing into actual action. For the first time in my adult life, I was making a decision based purely on my own desires rather than family obligations. "This should be straightforward," said Janet, the loan officer, as she pulled up my credit report on her computer screen. "You've got steady employment, good income history, and from what I can see here, you're generally responsible with credit." She paused, her eyebrows drawing together in confusion. "Although there's something odd here that we'll need to clarify." My stomach dropped before I even knew why. "What kind of odd?" "There's a credit card account showing on your report that I don't see any payment history for in your banking records. MasterCard opened 8 months ago. Current balance of $8,400. The payment history shows it's current, but the payments aren't coming from any of the accounts you've provided documentation for." I leaned forward, my mouth suddenly dry. "I didn't open any new credit cards 8 months ago. I haven't applied for new credit in over 2 years. Janet's expression shifted from confused to concerned. "The billing address on file is different from your current address, too. It shows 1247 Maple Street in Lakewood. Is that a previous address? 1247 Maple Street, my childhood home, my parents' address. Can you tell me what purchases were made on that card?" I asked, my voice sounding strangely distant to my own ears. Janet clicked through several screens, her frown deepening. "I can see some of the merchant categories. There are several charges to medical offices, what looks like spa services, and quite a few cash advances. The largest single charge is $3,500 to something called Rocky Mountain Cosmetic Surgery." The room started spinning. Rocky Mountain Cosmetic Surgery was where Claire had gotten her nose job 6 months ago. The procedure she'd claimed was a gift from a generous friend, when I'd asked how she'd afforded it. The same surgery I'd been too polite to question further, assuming she'd somehow saved up the money herself. "I need to see those records," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "All of them. This card was opened fraudulently." What followed was the most surreal hour of my life. Janet walked me through the process of filing a fraud report while simultaneously documenting every charge on the unauthorized account. The pattern that emerged was sickeningly familiar. Claire's cosmetic surgery, yes, but also monthly charges to a day spa in Cherry Creek that I knew Mom frequented. Cash withdrawals every Friday night in amounts of $200 to $300 from ATMs near the Black Hawk casinos where Mom had mentioned going just for fun with her church friends. The cash advances alone totaled over $4,000, all taken on Friday evenings and weekend nights. The spa charges were monthly, perfectly timed with Mom's standing appointments. There were charges to high-end department stores where Claire shopped, restaurants where my family dined for special occasions, and even what appeared to be the deposit for Claire's wedding dress. "The signature on the application," I said, my hands shaking as I held the paperwork Janet had printed. "Can I see it?" When she showed me the credit application, I stared at a version of my signature that was recognizable but not quite right. Someone had practiced writing my name, had studied my handwriting well enough to create a passable forgery, but the subtle differences were obvious to me. The way the S curled the slant of the letters, the pressure of the pen strokes, it was like looking at a photograph that had been slightly altered. "Who would have access to samples of your signature?" Janet asked gently. I thought about all the birthday cards I'd signed over the years, all the checks I'd written to family members, all the documents I'd left lying around during visits to my parents' house. I thought about Mom's careful way of handling paperwork, how she always offered to file things safely when I left important documents at their house. "My mother," I said quietly. Janet's professional composure slipped slightly. Family members committing identity theft is unfortunately more common than people realize. The good news is that we can dispute these charges and get this account removed from your credit report. The bad news is that you'll need to file a police report if you want to pursue prosecution. As we continued digging into my credit history, Janet discovered 2 other irregularities that made my blood run cold. My address was listed as an authorized contact for 3 other credit accounts that weren't mine, meaning bills and statements for someone else's debt were being sent to my apartment. When I thought about it, I realized Mom had asked for my new address when I'd moved last year, claiming she wanted to send me mail in case of emergencies. This suggests a pattern of systematic abuse, Janet explained carefully. Someone has been using your financial stability and good credit to leverage additional borrowing capacity. They're essentially using your creditworthiness as collateral for their own spending. The final piece of the puzzle came when Janet pulled a comprehensive credit monitoring report. There were 3 different loan applications that had been submitted using my information but with my parents' address over the past year. All had been rejected because the address discrepancy raised red flags, but the attempts were there, documented proof that someone had been shopping my identity around to multiple lenders. I sat in that sterile office surrounded by papers documenting months of betrayal, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't just about being taken advantage of anymore. This was criminal. They hadn't just been pressuring me to give them money, they'd been stealing my financial identity, gambling with my credit rating, and systematically undermining my economic security while I focused on being a good daughter and sister. The wedding demands the constant financial emergencies, the assumption that I would always be there to bail them out. It had all been a distraction. While I was writing checks and transferring money voluntarily, they were also helping themselves to resources I didn't even know I had provided. Every month I'd been supporting their lifestyle directly while they simultaneously drained my credit indirectly. They didn't just want my money, they'd been stealing my future. The dress shopping appointment came 3 days after my devastating discovery at the mortgage broker's office, and I almost canceled it twice before forcing myself to go. Claire had been texting me excited updates all week about the boutique she'd selected, Bella Bridal, an upscale shop in Cherry Creek where wedding dresses started at $3,000 and climbed rapidly from there. I knew I needed to maintain appearances until I was ready to execute my plan, so I plastered on a smile and met her at the appointed time. The boutique itself was everything Claire had dreamed of: crystal chandeliers, champagne service, and private dressing rooms larger than my first apartment. The moment we walked through the door, Claire transformed into the version of herself she reserved for expensive places, speaking in slightly louder tones and gesturing more dramatically, as if she needed everyone to know she belonged there. "This is my sister, Stephanie," Claire announced to the consultant, a woman named Vivian, who looked like she'd stepped out of a bridal magazine herself. "She's handling all the financial arrangements for my wedding. Money is absolutely no object." The casual way she said it, like she was discussing the weather, made my stomach clench. Vivian's eyes lit up with the unmistakable gleam of a salesperson sensing a lucrative commission. "How wonderful to have such family support," she said, directing her attention immediately to me. "Are there any budget parameters I should keep in mind?" "Oh no," Claire laughed, already gravitating toward the most expensive section of the store. "Stephanie is very successful in construction management. She's been taking care of me for years. Haven't you, sis?" I managed a tight smile and nodded, watching as Vivian began pulling dresses from the premium collection. Each gown Claire selected for trying on was more elaborate than the last hand-beaded bodices, cathedral-length trains, layers of imported silk and Italian lace. She held each dress up to herself in the mirror, already imagining herself floating down the aisle while I calculated the mounting costs. The first dress she tried on was $3,200, a confession Vivian made in hushed, reverent tones, as if the price was part of the gown's mystique. Claire emerged from the dressing room looking genuinely radiant, the kind of beautiful that makes bystanders stop and stare. But instead of simply admiring herself, she immediately began performing for the small audience of other customers and consultants. "What do you think, Stephanie?" she called out loud enough for everyone to hear. I know it's expensive, but you always said I deserved the best. And it's not like it's your wedding, you'll probably never need a dress this nice anyway. The comment hung in the air like a slap, and I felt every eye in the boutique turn toward me. An older woman trying on mother-of-the-bride dresses actually stopped mid-conversation with her daughter to stare. Another customer, a young woman about Claire's age, whispered something to her friend that made them both glance at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. "It's beautiful," I said carefully. "Let's see a few more options before deciding." The second dress was $3,800, the third was $4,200, and with each increasingly expensive option, Claire's commentary became more pointed. "Stephanie always tells me not to worry about money," she announced while admiring herself in a dress that cost more than most people's cars. "She says family is worth any sacrifice. Isn't that sweet?" It was during the fourth dress change that Claire asked me to join her in the dressing room to help with the intricate lacing system. Once the curtain was drawn and we were alone, her entire demeanor shifted. The performative brightness disappeared, replaced by something harder and more calculating. "I know this seems like a lot," she said quietly, not meeting my eyes in the mirror. "All the wedding expenses, I mean. And I know it's not exactly fair that you're paying for everything while I get to be the princess." I waited, sensing there was more coming. "But Mom always said you were the strong one," she continued, her voice taking on a wheedling quality I recognized from childhood. "You don't need things the way I do. You're good at taking care of yourself, at making money, at being responsible. I've never been good at any of that. I need someone to take care of me, and you need someone to take care of. It works out perfectly, doesn't it?" The twisted logic of her statement was breathtaking. She'd managed to reframe my exploitation as a mutually beneficial arrangement, as if my compulsive caretaking and her entitled dependency were complementary personality traits rather than a dysfunctional dynamic that had consumed my entire adult life. "Claire," I began, but she cut me off. "Please don't make this complicated, Stephanie. I know you can afford it, and this is my one chance to have everything I've dreamed of. After the wedding, things will be different. Eric and I will be more independent, but right now, I need this from you." When we emerged from the dressing room, Claire had selected the most expensive dress of the afternoon, a $4,500 creation that required an additional $800 in alterations. As Vivian began writing up the order, Claire couldn't contain her excitement. "My sister is so generous," she announced to the entire boutique, her voice carrying over the soft classical music and champagne-fueled conversations. "She's paying for my entire wedding, the dress, the venue, everything. I'm the luckiest girl in the world to have family like that." The reaction was immediate and mortifying. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Several women turned to stare openly. I heard whispered comments. "Can you imagine?" and "How embarrassing," that made my cheeks burn with shame. But it was the elderly woman I'd noticed earlier who delivered the most devastating blow. As we were leaving, she approached me near the door, her face kind but her eyes sad. "Honey," she said quietly, her voice gentle but firm. "I raised 4 daughters, and I've never seen anything like what just happened in there. Family shouldn't treat you like that. You deserve better." The stranger's pity hurt more than the betrayal, because they could see what I'd been blind to. The elderly woman's words followed me home from the boutique and haunted me through the weekend, but by Monday morning they had crystallized into something else entirely: determination. If my family was going to treat me like their personal ATM, if strangers could see the dysfunction more clearly than I had for years, then it was time to give everyone exactly what they expected from me. I would be the perfect coordinator, the responsible sister, the financial backbone they'd always counted on. I would be all of those things right up until the moment their world collapsed. The vendor communications began that very afternoon. I started with Bella Vista Gardens, the venue Mom had selected with such military precision. When I called, I spoke with Jennifer, the events coordinator, who had clearly been expecting my call based on the enthusiasm in her voice. "Ms. Collins, I'm so excited to work with you on Claire's wedding. Your mother mentioned you'd be handling all the arrangements. We have March 28th tentatively held for you, but we'll need to confirm with a deposit within the next 2 weeks to secure the date." Absolutely, I replied, settling into my office chair with a legal pad and my most professional voice. I'd like to go over all the details to make sure we're aligned on expectations. Can you email me the full contract with all terms and conditions? What followed was a masterclass in appearing committed while remaining completely uncommitted. Jennifer sent over a 15-page contract that I read with the careful attention I usually reserved for construction specifications. Buried in the fine print was exactly what I'd hoped to find: a clause stating that all bookings were tentative until final payment was received, and that cancellations made more than 72 hours before the event would result in forfeiture of deposit only. I responded with detailed questions about setup times, catering logistics, and parking arrangements. I requested floor plans and vendor access schedules. I asked about backup plans for weather and inquired about their liability insurance. To Jennifer, I appeared to be the most thorough client she'd ever worked with. In reality, I was creating a paper trail that would document exactly how seriously I'd taken their expectations without ever actually committing to anything. The same pattern played out with every vendor on Mom's meticulously researched list. The caterer received extensive emails about menu modifications and dietary restrictions. The florist got detailed requests about seasonal availability and delivery schedules. The photographer was sent elaborate shot lists and timeline requirements. Each conversation was professional, enthusiastic, and completely devoid of actual contract signatures or deposit payments. The beauty of the system was that vendors appreciated working with someone who asked intelligent questions and demonstrated genuine engagement with their services. They had no reason to doubt that final confirmations and payments would follow once all details were settled. Meanwhile, my family saw someone who was taking their wedding seriously, handling every vendor relationship with the professional competence they'd come to expect from me. Mom began bragging to the neighbors within days. I knew this because Mrs. Henderson from next door called to congratulate me on being such a generous sister, and mentioned how excited Mom was about the elegant venue and 5-course reception dinner. By the following week, Mom was sharing details with her church group about the beautiful spring wedding her daughters were planning together. Claire's social media presence exploded with wedding content. She posted photos of her dress appointment, tagged the venue in location updates, and shared elaborate Pinterest boards showcasing her vision. Her Instagram stories featured daily updates about wedding planning progress, always including grateful mentions of her amazing sister who's making all this possible. Her friends began commenting about how excited they were to attend such an elaborate celebration. Eric proved equally eager to capitalize on the anticipated festivities. He started mentioning the wedding in business networking events, using it as a conversation starter about family values and commitment. He created a Facebook event and began inviting his entire contact list, promising an evening of celebration and abundance at one of Denver's premier venues. His bachelor party planning commenced immediately with a weekend trip to Las Vegas that he justified as a once-in-a-lifetime celebration. Through it all, I documented everything with the methodical precision that had made me successful in construction management. Every text message about wedding expectations got screenshotted and filed. Every phone conversation where someone mentioned my obligation or generosity was noted with dates and direct quotes. Every social media post that assumed my financial commitment was preserved in carefully organized folders on my computer. When Mom sent me a casual text saying, "Don't forget the florist deposit is due Friday," I screenshotted it and filed it under financial assumptions. When Claire called to say, "You should probably transfer the catering money soon so they can order supplies," I documented the conversation and added it to my growing collection of evidence. When Eric texted to ask if I'd sorted out the band payment yet, I saved that too. The most revealing conversations happened during family dinners where the wedding dominated every discussion. They spoke about my financial contributions like discussing the weather, inevitable, predictable, requiring no actual confirmation from me. Mom would mention vendor deadlines while assuming I'd handle them. Claire would describe last-minute upgrades while taking for granted that I'd absorb the additional costs. Eric would suggest expensive add-ons while treating my wallet like a renewable resource. Each assumption became another piece of evidence. Each expectation got added to my documentation. Every casual reference to my responsibility was preserved for posterity. I was building a comprehensive record of exactly how my family viewed me, not as a person with autonomy and choice, but as a financial instrument that existed to enable their dreams. They were planning their party, but I was planning their reckoning. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was orchestrating the systematic destruction of my family's wedding fantasies, I was also experiencing the healthiest relationship of my adult life. Michael had been asking me out for coffee after our project meetings for weeks, and I'd finally said yes the previous Friday, mostly because I needed something normal to anchor me while everything else in my life spiraled toward calculated chaos. We'd moved beyond coffee to an actual dinner date at a small Italian restaurant in downtown Denver, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and wine served in mason jars, where the focus was on conversation rather than impressing anyone. Michael had chosen it specifically because it was quiet enough to talk, he'd said, and as we settled into our corner booth, I realized how foreign the concept of uninterrupted conversation had become to me. "You seem different tonight," Michael observed as we waited for our appetizers, his dark eyes studying my face with the same attention he brought to architectural blueprints. "More tense than usual. Everything okay with the Riverside project?" I took a sip of wine and considered how to answer. The truth was that the professional part of my life was the only thing going smoothly. It was everything else that felt like standing in the middle of an earthquake while pretending the ground wasn't shifting beneath my feet. "Work's fine," I said finally. "It's more personal stuff. Family obligations, you know how it is." "Actually, I don't," Michael replied gently, and something in his tone made me look up from my wine glass. "Tell me about these obligations. What does your family expect from you?" The question caught me off guard, partly because of how he'd phrased it. Not "how is your family" or "what's going on at home," but what did they expect from me specifically? As if he'd already sensed that my family dynamics weren't quite normal. "Well, my sister's getting married," I began, and then found myself explaining the venue costs, the dress expenses, the elaborate reception plans. Michael listened without interrupting, but I could see his expression changing as I described the $50,000 budget and my role as sole financier. "Wait," he said, finally setting down his fork. "Let me make sure I understand this. Your sister is having a wedding that costs more than most people's annual salary, and you're paying for all of it. What's her contribution?" "She's the bride," I said automatically, then realized how absurd that sounded when spoken aloud to someone outside the family ecosystem. "And your parents' contribution, they're providing emotional support and planning assistance." Michael stared at me for a long moment, and I could practically see him processing this information. "Stephanie, what did you want to be when you were younger, before all this family financial management took over your life?" The question blindsided me completely. When was the last time someone had asked about my dreams rather than my bank account? I found myself struggling to remember what I'd wanted before I'd become the family's financial solution to every problem. "I wanted to be an architect," I said slowly, the words feeling rusty from disuse. "I used to spend hours drawing building designs, imagining spaces that would make people feel happy and safe. I had this whole portfolio of sketches when I was in high school, houses with big windows and gardens, office buildings with natural light and green spaces integrated into the design. What happened to that dream?" The simple question hit me like a physical blow. What had happened was Claire's college tuition and Mom's medical bills and a dozen other family crises that had required me to choose the most immediately lucrative career path rather than following my passion. "Life got complicated," I said, but Michael's expression told me he wasn't buying that explanation. "Stephanie, I need to say something, and I hope you won't take it the wrong way." He leaned forward, his voice serious. "What you're describing isn't normal family support. That's exploitation. Healthy families don't designate one person as the financial resource for everyone else's dreams, while that person sacrifices their own." I started to protest, to offer the familiar explanations about family loyalty and shared responsibility. But Michael continued, I come from a big family, 4 siblings, lots of cousins, parents who struggled financially when we were kids. We've all helped each other out over the years, but it's always been reciprocal. When my brother needed help with his house down payment, 3 of us pitched in and he paid us back over 2 years. When my sister was going through her divorce, we all contributed to her legal fees, but she never expected any one person to carry the entire burden. He paused, studying my face. Has your family ever helped you with anything, ever made a sacrifice for your dreams the way you've sacrificed for theirs? The question hung in the air between us, and I found myself mentally scanning through years of family interactions looking for examples of reciprocal support. The search came up empty. They need me, I said weakly. Everyone needs support sometimes. But need and exploitation are different things. What do you need, Stephanie? When's the last time someone in your family asked that question? I couldn't remember. I literally could not recall a single conversation where anyone had inquired about my needs, my dreams, my happiness without immediately segueing into how I could help with their problems. There's a community college near here that offers evening drafting classes, Michael said, pulling out his phone and showing me a website. Just for fun, no pressure, no career implications. 2 hours a week where you get to remember what it feels like to create something for yourself instead of solving everyone else's problems. Looking at the course description, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Excitement about something that was purely mine. No family obligations attached, no financial implications for anyone else. Just me exploring an interest I'd abandoned a decade ago. I don't know if I have time. I started to say the automatic response so ingrained I almost didn't notice I was making it. You have time for a $50,000 wedding that you're not even invited to attend, Michael pointed out quietly. Maybe you can find 2 hours a week for something that might actually make you happy. He was showing me a life where I mattered, and that made going back to theirs unbearable. The night before the wedding, my phone became a weapon of mass destruction pointed directly at my sanity. It started at 7:30 in the morning, with Mom's voice pitched 3 octaves higher than normal, leaving a voicemail that began with, "Stephanie, we have a crisis," and escalated from there into pure hysteria. "The florist needs final payment by noon, or they're canceling the order," she continued, her words tumbling over each other in panic. "I know you said you'd handle everything, but they're being very insistent about payment today. Claire is beside herself. You need to call them immediately." Before I could even process that message, my phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "OMG, the cake people are asking about final payment too. They want a cashier's check by 3 p.m. Also, the string quartet is asking about their fee. And Mom says you have their contact info. This is so stressful." I was still reading Claire's message when Eric's text came through. "Hey Stephanie, quick question about the bachelor party expenses from last weekend. The guys split the costs, but we put everything on my card expecting reimbursement. Total came to $1,200. Can you Venmo me today? Thanks." By 10 a.m., my phone had buzzed 17 times. Mom called twice more, each message more frantic than the last. Claire sent a steady stream of texts about vendor confirmations, setup questions, and last-minute additions she'd apparently approved without consulting anyone. Eric contributed his own series of messages about groomsmen gifts, transportation arrangements, and something about upgraded bar service that he'd taken the liberty of arranging, with the assumption that I'd cover the difference. The beautiful irony was that their panic was making my own preparation easier. Every desperate call and frantic text was further evidence of their complete dependence on my financial support documentation I would include in the letters I was writing. Their hysteria provided perfect cover for my unusual calm. "I'll handle everything first thing in the morning," became my standard response to every crisis. When Mom called sobbing about the photographer's equipment insurance fee, I assured her calmly that I'd take care of it. When Claire texted in all capitals about the venue coordinator asking for final headcount confirmation, I replied with my usual promise to manage the details. When Eric called asking about the rehearsal dinner bar tab from the night before, I told him not to worry about it. My serenity in the face of their chaos only reinforced their belief that I had everything under control. They were so focused on their immediate panic that they didn't question why I wasn't asking for vendor contact information or requesting invoice details. They were drowning in last-minute wedding stress, and my calm voice was the life preserver they clung to without examining too closely. While they spiraled into pre-wedding madness, I was methodically completing the most liberating preparations of my adult life. The small suitcase I packed contained only essentials: 3 sundresses, sandals, a book I'd been meaning to read for 2 years, and the red bikini I'd bought online but never had occasion to wear. The Hawaii flight I'd booked for 5 a.m. departure would have me on a beach in Maui by early afternoon Pacific time, while my family was discovering the true meaning of consequences. The letters took the longest to write, and they became more cathartic than I'd expected. Mom's letter detailed every financial manipulation, every guilt trip, every assumption that my money was theirs by right. I included specific examples with dates and amounts, creating a comprehensive record of 10 years of exploitation disguised as family love. Claire's letter was shorter but more pointed, focusing on her deliberate complicity in the family's financial abuse and her entitled assumption that having dreams meant someone else should pay for them. Eric's letter was the most satisfying, to write a detailed explanation of how I'd discovered his pattern of targeting women with financially generous family members, complete with screenshots of his previous engagements, and the research I'd compiled about his systematic approach to relationship fraud. I printed every piece of evidence I'd collected over the past weeks: screenshots of text messages, email threads with vendors, documentation of their social media posts, assuming my financial commitment bank records showing the fraudulent credit card usage, and copies of every conversation where they'd treated my wallet like community property. Each family member would receive a complete portfolio of their own behavior, impossible to deny or minimize. The package I prepared for mailing contained every gift they'd given me over the past decade, along with copies of the receipts showing I'd paid for each item myself. The necklace Claire had given me for my birthday, purchased with my own money, transferred to her account the week before. The picture frame from Mom with "World's Best Daughter" engraved on it, bought with the credit card she'd fraudulently opened in my name. The book Eric had thoughtfully selected for me, charged to the same stolen credit card, and given to me as if it represented his consideration for my interests. I set up automated email delivery for 9 a.m., ensuring that each family member would receive their personalized documentation package at precisely the moment they should be getting ready for the ceremony. The timing was crucial, late enough that they couldn't reach me to argue, or manipulate early enough that they'd have to face the reality of their situation while their guests were arriving at an empty venue. My phone went quiet around midnight, after a final flurry of texts from Claire about emergency touch-ups and last-minute dress alterations. I turned off all notifications, set my alarm for 4 a.m., and went to sleep with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. While they dreamed of their perfect day, I was planning to give them a perfect lesson. By the time my plane was cruising at 30,000 feet over the Rocky Mountains, the first guests were arriving at Bella Vista Gardens, expecting to witness Claire's fairy tale wedding. I learned about the unfolding disaster much later through a combination of social media posts, frantic voicemails, and detailed accounts from the few family friends who remained willing to speak to me afterward. But even from my airplane seat, sipping complimentary orange juice and watching Denver disappear beneath the clouds, I could imagine the scene with perfect clarity. The early arrivals would have been Eric's groomsmen, and their dates dressed in their rented tuxedos and cocktail dresses, pulling into the venue's circular driveway around 10:30 for the noon ceremony. They would have expected to see vendor trucks unloading flowers and catering equipment, staff members setting up chairs and sound systems, the bustling activity of a wedding day in full swing. Instead, they found a parking lot that looked exactly as it had the day before, empty, quiet, with no signs of preparation for anything more elaborate than an ordinary Saturday. The venue's assistant manager, a young woman named Katie, who would later become an unwitting star of several wedding disaster videos, met the first confused guests at the front door. According to her later account to local news stations, she'd been expecting this moment since the previous afternoon, when her final calls to the supposed event coordinator had gone straight to voicemail. The booking had expired at midnight due to non-payment, she explained to the increasingly bewildered wedding party, and no vendors had been authorized to begin setup. By 11 a.m., when Mom arrived in her mother-of-the-bride dress, expecting to oversee final preparations, the parking lot was filled with guests standing around in formal wear, checking their phones, and asking each other if they had the right location. Mom's arrival in Dad's car, honking the horn and waving enthusiastically from the passenger seat, created a brief moment of hope among the assembled crowd. Surely the mother of the bride would know what was happening. The hope lasted exactly as long as it took Mom to walk through the front doors of Bella Vista Gardens and discover that the main reception hall contained nothing but empty tables and chairs stacked against the walls. No white linens, no centerpieces, no dance floor, no evidence whatsoever that a wedding was supposed to happen in 1 hour. Katie watched Mom's face transform from confident expectation to confused concern to dawning horror in the span of 30 seconds. The phone calls that followed created their own chaos. Mom's frantic attempts to reach vendors produced a symphony of identical responses. No final payment had been received. No setup authorization had been given. No equipment would be delivered without confirmed payment. The florist, who had prepared $2,000 worth of white roses and peonies, explained that company policy required full payment 48 hours before delivery. The caterer, who had planned a 5-course meal for 200 guests, said their trucks were sitting at the warehouse waiting for financial clearance that never came. The string quartet was at home, having assumed the event was canceled when no payment confirmation arrived. Mom's desperate call to the venue manager brought Jennifer rushing from her office with a thick folder of documentation. The conversation that followed, conducted in the lobby while confused guests pressed their faces against the windows, laid out the brutal facts with professional politeness. The booking had been tentative pending final payment. Multiple confirmation calls had gone unanswered. The cancellation deadline had passed. The venue was not responsible for vendor coordination without confirmed booking status. It was during this explanation that Claire's limousine pulled up outside her white dress, visible through the car's rear window. The photographer Eric had hired, one of the few vendors who worked on payment after delivery terms, captured the moment Claire stepped out of the car in her $4,500 gown, expecting to be greeted by her wedding party, and instead finding clusters of overdressed people standing around looking lost and uncomfortable. The sight of Claire in her elaborate dress walking toward a building that clearly contained no wedding created a surreal tableau that several guests began recording on their phones. She moved like someone still living in the fantasy, her train trailing behind her on the asphalt, her tiara glinting in the morning sun. While behind her, the reality of the situation became increasingly obvious to everyone except her. Eric's face, when he realized what was happening, became the subject of particular fascination for wedding disaster enthusiasts online. The transformation from confident groom to mortified fraud was captured in high definition by multiple phones and later set to music by creative social media users. His red-faced stammering when guests began asking questions about vendors and payments provided clear evidence of his gold-digger nature to anyone who hadn't seen it before. The question that cut through the growing chaos came from Eric's great-aunt Martha, an elderly woman with a voice trained by decades of teaching elementary school. Standing in the empty reception hall while Claire stood frozen in her wedding dress, Aunt Martha asked the question that everyone was thinking: where's the sister who paid for everything? Shouldn't she be here managing this disaster? The silence in that empty hall was louder than any music could ever be. The breakdown began with Mom's voice echoing through the empty reception hall, a sound so raw and primal that it cut through the confused murmur of 200 wedding guests like a scream in a library. I would later watch this moment dozens of times on various social media platforms, as multiple guests had begun recording when the situation became obviously disastrous. But the audio was what made the videos go viral. The sound of a woman completely losing control in the most public way possible. "Stephanie!" Mom's voice cracked as she screamed my name, her careful mother-of-the-bride composure shattering like glass hitting concrete. "Stephanie Collins, where are you? You did this, you ruined everything." She stood in the center of the empty dance floor, her pale blue dress wrinkled from grabbing at her phone, her usually perfect hair disheveled from running her hands through it in panic. What followed was a verbal explosion that would haunt family gatherings for years to come, if there were any family gatherings to be haunted. Mom began listing every perceived flaw in my character at maximum volume, her voice carrying across the reception hall and out to the parking lot where guests who had fled the awkwardness were still standing around in bewilderment. She's selfish. She's vindictive. After everything this family has done for her, after all the love and support we've given her, this is how she repays us. Mom's accusations grew more elaborate and desperate as she realized the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around her. She promised to handle everything, she lied to us. She's jealous because Claire is beautiful and getting married and she's going to die alone. The cruelest irony was that every word she screamed provided perfect evidence of exactly why I had reached my breaking point. With each accusation, each blame-filled rant, each attempt to make me the villain in their story, she was demonstrating to 200 witnesses the toxic family dynamic that had consumed my adult life. Claire stood frozen beside her, still in her wedding dress, mascara beginning to streak down her cheeks, as the reality of the situation slowly penetrated her shock. Dad hovered nearby, looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor, occasionally reaching toward Mom, as if to calm her but never quite making contact, his lifetime pattern of conflict avoidance continuing even in this moment of ultimate family crisis. The guests' reactions created a fascinating study in group dynamics. Eric's friends and family, who had never met me and knew nothing about our family's financial arrangements, looked confused and uncomfortable, checking their phones for other places to be on a Saturday afternoon. But Mom's church friends and our longtime neighbors began piecing together the real story behind Mom's meltdown, and their expressions shifted from confusion to understanding to judgment. I learned later that Mrs. Patterson, who had lived next door to my parents for 15 years, was overheard telling her husband, "I always wondered how they afforded Claire's fancy car and that nose job on Robert's hardware store salary. That poor Stephanie has been funding their lifestyle for years." Her comments sparked a ripple of similar observations among the older women who had watched our family dynamics play out at church functions and neighborhood gatherings. "Remember when Stephanie missed Sarah Jensen's wedding because she was working overtime to pay for Claire's spring break trip?" whispered Mrs. Chen from Mom's Bible study group. "And that time she couldn't afford to fix her own car because she'd just paid for Claire's apartment deposit." The conversations began as whispers but grew louder as more people connected the dots between Mom's accusations and the financial exploitation they had witnessed over the years. Several of the older wedding guests began quietly gathering their purses and checking their watches, the universal signals of people preparing to leave an uncomfortable situation. But it was Eric's reaction that provided the most damning evidence of his true character. The moment he realized that no last-minute financial rescue was coming, that no mysterious family money would appear to salvage the situation, his entire demeanor changed with stunning speed. The charming fiancé, who had spent months wooing Claire and flattering my parents, disappeared, replaced by a man whose primary concern was protecting his own reputation. I later heard from multiple sources that Eric was overheard telling his groomsmen, "I was completely misled about their financial situation. Claire told me her sister was wealthy and generous, but this is obviously some kind of family dysfunction I want no part of." His voice carried the indignant tone of someone who had been the victim of false advertising, rather than a man whose bride was standing in ruins beside him. His best man was recorded asking, "What are you going to do?" And Eric's response became legendary among wedding disaster enthusiasts. "Cut my losses. This whole family is obviously unstable, and I'm not signing up for years of drama and financial chaos." While Claire stood there in her expensive dress, still processing the destruction of her wedding day, Eric was already calculating his exit strategy. He removed his boutonniere with the casual efficiency of a man taking off a work uniform, handed it to his best man, and began walking toward the parking lot without a word to his bride of 0 minutes. The man who had promised to love her forever couldn't get away fast enough when the money dried up. While Eric was abandoning Claire in that empty reception hall, and my mother was screaming my name to an audience of horrified wedding guests, I was lying on a beach chair at Waikiki, watching the Pacific Ocean stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The contrast wasn't lost on me at the exact moment my family was discovering the consequences of taking me for granted. I was experiencing the most profound peace I'd felt in over a decade. The red bikini I wore was a small act of rebellion that felt monumentally significant. I'd bought it online 3 weeks earlier in a moment of unprecedented self-indulgence, the first piece of clothing I'd purchased for myself rather than out of necessity in longer than I could remember. It was bright, bold, and completely impractical, everything my family would have criticized if they'd seen it. The fabric felt like freedom against my skin, warm from the Hawaiian sun that beat down without judgment or expectation. My beach chair was positioned perfectly to catch both the morning sun and the gentle trade winds that kept the temperature comfortable despite the intensity of the tropical heat. To my left, a young couple was building an elaborate sandcastle with their toddler, their laughter mixing with the rhythmic sound of waves breaking on the shore. To my right, an elderly man was reading a paperback novel, occasionally glancing up to watch surfers riding waves in the distance. Everyone around me was engaged in the simple act of enjoying themselves without owing anyone anything. The Mai Tai in my hand was my second of the day, though it was only just past noon. The drink was ridiculously expensive by my usual standards, $18 for rum and fruit juice, but I'd ordered it without checking the price, without calculating how the cost would impact my monthly budget, without considering whether someone else needed that money more than I needed the drink. The financial freedom was almost as intoxicating as the alcohol. I had been savoring the peaceful solitude for about an hour when curiosity finally overcame my determination to stay disconnected from the chaos I'd left behind. My phone had been on airplane mode since before my flight took off, creating a blissful bubble of silence that I knew would burst the moment I reconnected with the outside world. But the temptation to witness the aftermath of my carefully orchestrated absence proved too strong to resist. The phone took several seconds to reconnect to the cellular network, and then it began buzzing with the frantic intensity of a smoke alarm. Notification after notification flooded the screen in an overwhelming cascade of digital desperation. The numbers were staggering: 127 missed calls, 89 text messages, 23 voicemails, and countless notifications from social media platforms where I'd apparently been tagged in multiple posts. Mom had called 43 times, her contact frequency increasing throughout the morning as the wedding disaster unfolded. The timestamps told the story of her growing panic calls every few minutes at first, then every 30 seconds, as the situation became increasingly desperate. Dad had called 11 times, his attempts clustered around the time Mom's meltdown was probably reaching its peak. Claire's 22 missed calls were interspersed with text messages that grew progressively more incoherent as autocorrect struggled to interpret her hysteria. Even Eric had called twice, which I found grimly amusing considering he'd probably fled the scene before the afternoon was half over. His voicemails, which I played on speaker while sipping my Mai Tai, were masterpieces of entitled indignation demanding to know where I was and insisting that I owed him an explanation for the disaster I'd created. The text messages provided a fascinating timeline of the morning's events. Claire's early messages were confused, but still optimistic. "Where are you?" "The vendors are asking questions," gradually evolved into panic. "Stephanie, please call me back. Everything is falling apart." And finally, despair. "How could you do this to me on my wedding day?" Mom's texts were longer and more accusatory, filled with typos that revealed her shaking hands and fragmented thoughts. "You are destroying your sister's happiness" became, "How can you be so selfish after everything we've done for you?" And eventually, "This family will never forgive you for this betrayal." The voicemails were almost too painful to listen to, not because they made me feel guilty, but because they revealed how completely my family had missed the point of my absence. Not one message included an apology for their treatment of me. Not one acknowledged their exploitation of my generosity. Not one suggested they understood why I might have reached a breaking point. They were all variations on the same theme. I was selfish, I was vindictive. I was ruining Claire's special day, and I needed to fix everything immediately. After scrolling through the evidence of their desperation for about 10 minutes, I turned the phone back to airplane mode and set it face down on the small table beside my beach chair. The silence that followed felt like taking a deep breath after holding it for years. That's when the tears came, surprising me with their intensity. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was crying not from frustration or exhaustion or the weight of impossible expectations, but from relief. The tears were cleansing, washing away years of accumulated resentment and guilt and obligation that had settled into my bones like sediment. I mourned the family I had thought I had, the loving relationships I had believed existed beneath all the financial transactions. I grieved for the daughter and sister I had tried so hard to be the one who sacrificed everything in pursuit of approval that was never really available. But mixed with the sadness was something lighter and more powerful. Pure, unburdened joy at the realization that I was finally free. The ocean waves that crashed rhythmically on the shore seemed to be washing away the last traces of my old life with each surge and retreat. I watched my tears fall onto the warm sand and disappear, leaving no trace behind, just like the footprints that were erased by each incoming wave. Freedom tastes like salt air and sounds like silence, and I was never going back. The digital reckoning began while I was still floating in the hotel pool. 3 days later, my phone finally reconnected to Wi-Fi, but still blissfully ignored on the poolside table. I had been living in a beautiful bubble of disconnection, ordering room service, reading novels, and swimming in water so clear I could count the tiles on the pool bottom. It wasn't until a text from Michael broke through my vacation haze that I realized my family's wedding disaster had become something much bigger than a private humiliation. Stephanie, I don't know if you've seen what's happening online, but I want you to know that everyone at Morrison is completely on your side. Call me when you're ready to talk. You're not alone in this. His message confused me enough to finally check my social media accounts, and what I found there left me staring at my phone screen in disbelief. Someone at the wedding, I later discovered it was Eric's cousin who had been live streaming what she thought would be romantic pre-ceremony footage, had captured the entire disaster in high definition. The video had been uploaded with the caption, "When the money runs out at a wedding," and had already been viewed over 2 million times. The footage was devastating in its completeness. It began with guests arriving and their formal wear confusion growing as they realized no preparations had been made, and climaxed with Mom's complete breakdown in the empty reception hall. The audio quality was crystal clear, capturing every word of her screaming rant about my selfishness and ingratitude. But what made the video truly viral was the reaction shots, the faces of wedding guests as they realized what they were witnessing, the whispered conversations, as people pieced together the story, and Eric's rapid exit from the scene. The hashtag #HadEmptyWedding was trending across multiple platforms, and the comments section had become a battlefield of opinions. Some viewers were appalled by what they saw as my cruelty toward my family. "Imagine destroying your sister's wedding day out of spite," wrote one user. "Family is supposed to be there for each other no matter what." These commenters focused on the spectacle of Claire in her wedding dress standing in an empty hall, painting me as a vindictive sister who had chosen the most hurtful way possible to make a point. But they were vastly outnumbered by people who saw the situation differently. "That woman's meltdown tells you everything you need to know about how they treated the sister," commented someone with thousands of likes. "You don't scream at someone like that unless you've been taking them for granted for years." Another popular comment read, "The fact that they expected her to pay for a wedding she wasn't even invited to attend says everything about this family dynamic." The video had been picked up by several online publications that specialized in wedding disasters and family drama. A website called Wedding Fails Weekly had written an entire article analyzing the footage, complete with timestamps, highlighting the most revealing moments. They'd identified the moment when Mom's accusations shifted from general blame to specific financial details, effectively confirming that I had indeed been funding the family's lifestyle for years. But it was the local Facebook groups where the real conversation was happening. The Denver Metro Moms group had exploded with discussion about the video, and reading through the comments felt like discovering I wasn't alone in a way I'd never imagined possible. Dozens of women were sharing their own stories of family financial exploitation, creating a thread that stretched for hundreds of comments. "This could have been my story," wrote Jennifer Martinez, a mother of 3 whose profile showed she lived just 2 neighborhoods over from my parents. "My sister expected me to pay for her entire nursing school program because I made more money, then didn't invite me to her graduation, because it was just for immediate family." Her comment had over 300 likes and 50 replies from women sharing similar experiences. Sarah Thompson, whose name I recognized from church functions, wrote, "I watched Stephanie at family gatherings for years, always in the background while Claire was the center of attention. Every conversation about Stephanie eventually turned into what she could do for everyone else. This was a long time coming." Her insider perspective lent credibility to the supportive comments and helped shift the narrative away from family loyalty toward recognizing financial abuse. The conversation at my office, which I learned about through a group text from my project team, was equally supportive but more personal. My colleagues had witnessed years of family interruptions during work hours. The panicked phone calls about Claire's emergencies, the stress that appeared on my face every time my family needed something, the vacation days I'd use to deal with family crises rather than actually resting. Tom Rodriguez, the senior project manager, had apparently told the entire construction crew, "Anyone who's worked with Stephanie knows she's been supporting that family for years. We've all seen her skip lunch to wire money for some family emergency. Good for her for finally putting herself first." The crew's response had been unanimously supportive, with several guys sharing their own stories of family members who had taken advantage of their generosity. Even more surprising was the response from clients and vendors who had worked with our company. Several had reached out directly to Morrison's main office to express support for me, mentioning times they'd witnessed family calls interrupting business meetings or noticed my stress levels spike after personal phone conversations. My professional reputation, which I'd worried might suffer from the public nature of the family drama, was actually improving as people gained insight into the personal challenges I'd been managing while maintaining my work performance. The most touching messages came from other women in construction and project management, an industry where female professionals often felt pressure to prove they could handle everything without showing weakness. "You've inspired a lot of us to examine our own boundaries," wrote Lisa Chang, a project manager from a competing firm. "Thank you for showing that walking away from toxicity is brave, not selfish." I'd become famous for walking away, and strangers were cheering me on. The support from strangers online gave me courage I hadn't expected to need when I returned to Denver a week later, tanned and more rested than I'd been in years. My first stop wasn't home or the office, but the bank where Janet was waiting with a folder thick enough to choke a horse, and an expression that mixed professional sympathy with barely contained outrage. "I've never seen identity theft this systematic within a family," she said, spreading documents across the conference table like evidence at a crime scene. "Your mother didn't just open one fraudulent account. We've found 3 credit cards, 2 personal loans, and what appears to be an attempt to refinance your car without your knowledge. The forgery is extensive and sophisticated." The handwriting analysis report she showed me was damning in its precision. A certified expert had compared Mom's forged versions of my signature to authentic samples and documented 17 distinct differences that proved deliberate deception rather than simple mistakes. The loan applications contained fabricated employment information, inflated income figures, and addresses that mixed my current location with my parents' home in ways clearly designed to confuse verification processes. "We're required by federal law to report identity theft of this magnitude to law enforcement," Janet explained, sliding a business card across the table. "Detective Morrison from the Financial Crimes Unit will be handling your case. The bank is pressing charges regardless of your personal decision about prosecution, because this represents a systematic attempt to defraud our institution." The realization that this had moved beyond family drama into criminal territory felt surreal. Mom hadn't just hurt my feelings or taken advantage of my generosity, she had committed multiple felonies that could result in prison time. The woman who had raised me to believe that family loyalty trumped all other considerations had betrayed me so thoroughly that federal agencies were now involved. I was still processing this information when I returned to my apartment that afternoon and found Mom waiting in the hallway outside my door. She looked terrible, her hair unwashed, her clothes wrinkled, her eyes red from what appeared to be days of crying. But when she saw me approaching with my suitcase, her expression shifted through a rapid succession of emotions: relief, anger, desperation, and something that looked almost like fear. "There you are," she said, her voice pitched higher than normal. "Do you have any idea what you've put this family through? Your sister's wedding was ruined. The whole neighborhood is talking about us, and now there are lawyers involved and police asking questions. How could you be so vindictive?" I unlocked my door without responding, but she followed me inside, her voice gaining volume and hysteria as she continued. "This is all a terrible misunderstanding, Stephanie. Family helps family, that's what families do. Yes, I used your credit information, but it was for family expenses. You've always been so generous, and I knew you wouldn't mind helping out when Claire needed things." The casual way she admitted to the fraud was stunning. She spoke about identity theft like discussing borrowing sugar from a neighbor, as if my financial identity was community property that she had every right to access. When I showed her the police report I'd filed that morning, her demeanor shifted from indignant to panicked in seconds. "You called the police on your own mother?" Her voice cracked with genuine shock. "After everything I've done for you, after raising you and loving you and supporting your dreams, you're going to destroy my life over some credit card bills." "Mom, you committed identity theft," I said quietly. "Multiple times, with forged signatures. This isn't about credit card bills. This is about felony fraud." She collapsed into my kitchen chair, her bravado crumbling as the legal reality penetrated her self-justification. "I never meant for it to go this far," she whispered. "Claire needed so many things, and your father's salary barely covers the basics. You were doing so well financially, and I thought you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit more." The conversation that followed revealed the extent of her financial desperation and entitlement. She had been gambling regularly at the Black Hawk casinos for over 2 years, initially with church bingo money, but escalating to credit advances when her luck ran out. The spa treatments, the expensive dinners, Claire's cosmetic surgery, all had been funded through a combination of my direct payments and the fraudulent credit accounts she'd opened in my name. Detective Morrison arrived at my apartment 3 hours later, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and the patient demeanor of someone who had seen every possible variation of family financial crime. She explained the charges Mom was facing with clinical precision: identity theft, in the first-degree criminal impersonation forgery, and credit card fraud. The potential sentences ranged from 2 to 12 years in prison depending on the total amount of money involved and whether Mom had a prior criminal record. "The good news is that she's been cooperative with our investigation," Detective Morrison said. "She's admitted to the forgery and provided documentation about where the money went. The bad news is that cooperation doesn't eliminate criminal charges when the fraud is this extensive and systematic." She explained that the decision about prosecution was partly mine and partly out of my hands. The bank and credit card companies were pursuing charges regardless of my personal feelings because they had lost money due to Mom's fraudulent activities. But my cooperation as the victim would significantly impact the strength of the case and potentially influence sentencing recommendations. "I need to think about this," I told Detective Morrison, looking at Mom sitting hunched in my kitchen chair, suddenly looking much older than her 58 years. "Take your time," she replied, "but understand that your mother made these choices over a period of months, systematically and deliberately. She didn't make one mistake, she made dozens of calculated decisions to commit fraud using your identity." After they both left, I sat alone in my apartment with the legal documents scattered across my coffee table, finally understanding that the power dynamic in my family had shifted completely and permanently. For 28 years, Mom had held all the cards controlling family relationships through guilt manipulation and my desperate need for approval. Now she was facing felony charges, social humiliation, and potential imprisonment because of choices she'd made while taking my financial stability for granted. She'd gambled with my credit, and now she was gambling with her freedom. The call from Dad came 2 days later, his voice uncharacteristically firm despite the obvious nervousness. "Stephanie, I need to talk to you. Just you, not your mother, not Claire. Can you meet me at Murphy's Diner on Colfax tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock?" The request was so unlike him. Dad never initiated difficult conversations, never asked to meet privately, never excluded Mom from family discussions, that I agreed immediately more curious than anything else. Murphy's Diner was the kind of place Dad felt comfortable with, vinyl booths and coffee that had been brewing since dawn, and waitresses who called everyone honey. I found him in a corner booth already nursing what looked like his second cup of coffee and staring out the window with an expression I'd never seen before, determined but defeated, like a man who had finally decided to confess to a crime that had been eating at him for years. "Thank you for coming," he said as I slid into the booth across from him. "I wasn't sure you would after everything that's happened. I wouldn't blame you for never wanting to see any of us again." He looked older than I remembered, the lines around his eyes. Deeper, his shoulders more stooped, as if the weight of whatever he needed to tell me had been physically wearing him down. When the waitress came over, he ordered us both coffee and waited until she was out of earshot before speaking again. "I've been a coward," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. "For 28 years, I've watched your mother treat you like a bank account instead of a daughter, and I never said a word. I told myself it was keeping peace in the family, that intervening would just make things worse. But the truth is, I was afraid of her anger, and I let you pay the price for my weakness." The admission hit me harder than I'd expected. Part of me had always hoped that Dad was just oblivious to the family dynamics that his silence came from not understanding rather than deliberate avoidance. Hearing him acknowledge his role in my exploitation was somehow more painful than Mom's active manipulation. "I kept telling myself that you were strong enough to handle it, that you didn't seem to mind helping out, that families were supposed to support each other." He continued, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup like he was trying to draw warmth from it. "But watching your mother scream at you in that empty wedding hall, seeing how she blamed you for everything while taking no responsibility for her own behavior, I finally understood what I'd been enabling all these years." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope thick with documents that he placed carefully on the table between us. "There's something you need to know, something I should have told you years ago but didn't have the courage to face." Inside the envelope were legal documents, bank records, and correspondence that I recognized immediately, papers from my grandmother's estate dated 5 years earlier. Grandma Collins had always been my favorite relative, the one person in the family who seemed to see me as more than just a resource to be tapped. When she died, I had mourned not just her loss, but also the end of the only unconditional love I'd felt from my family. "Your grandmother left you $50,000 in her will," Dad said, his voice thick with shame. "She specified that it was to go directly to you for your education or your future, because she said you were the one person in this family who never asked for anything, but gave everything." I stared at the will, seeing my name clearly listed as the primary beneficiary for a substantial portion of Grandma's estate. According to the bank documents, the money had been deposited into an account in my name, but one I'd never seen or had access to. The account statements showed a series of withdrawals over 18 months, each one signed with a version of my signature that looked close, but not quite right. "Your mother intercepted all the estate correspondence," Dad continued. "She had mail forwarded to a P.O. box she rented specifically for this purpose, then forged the necessary paperwork to access the account. I found out about it 6 months after Grandma died when I was going through some papers and found copies of the estate documents she'd hidden." The bank statements told the story of how my inheritance had been spent. A large withdrawal coincided with Claire's cosmetic surgery. Another chunk had been used for what the memo line described as family vacation expenses, the cruise to Alaska that Mom and Claire had taken the previous summer, claiming they'd won it in a church raffle. Smaller amounts had been withdrawn regularly, apparently used for the routine expenses that Mom had been asking me to cover throughout the same period. "I confronted your mother about it." Dad said, his voice dropping to barely audible levels. She said it was all for family expenses anyway, that you wouldn't have minded that she was just saving everyone the trouble of asking for the money directly. She made it sound almost reasonable, like she was doing you a favor by handling the financial details. I felt sick looking at the documents, seeing the systematic way my inheritance had been stolen and spent while I continued sending money home each month, completely unaware that there was a fund specifically designated for my benefit that was being drained to support the same family demands I was already covering from my salary. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Because I'm a coward," he repeated. "Because your mother said it would destroy the family if it came out, because I was afraid of the conflict it would cause, because I've spent 35 years of marriage avoiding difficult conversations by pretending problems don't exist." He pulled another set of documents from the envelope, these more recent and bearing Detective Morrison's business card clipped to the top. "I know about the credit card fraud too," he admitted. "I've known for months. I saw the bills coming to the house, saw your mother getting nervous when the phone rang, overheard her practicing your signature at the kitchen table. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to stop her or warn you." The weight of his confession settled over the table like a blanket. Dad hadn't just been passively enabling Mom's financial abuse, he'd been an active accomplice through his silence, watching her commit multiple felonies without intervention. His guilt was written in every line of his face, but it had taken a public family disaster to finally motivate him to speak up. "I'll testify about all of it if you need me to," he said finally. "The inheritance theft, the credit card fraud, the pattern of financial abuse I've watched for years. I know it won't undo the damage I've caused by staying silent, but maybe it can help make sure justice gets served. 28 years. I'd wondered why Grandma never left me anything, turns out she had. And they stole that too. Learning about the stolen inheritance from Dad left me feeling hollowed out in a way I hadn't expected, but I threw myself back into work with renewed focus, grateful for the normalcy of construction schedules and vendor meetings. It was Thursday afternoon when my assistant knocked on my office door with an expression that mixed concern with barely suppressed curiosity. "Stephanie, there's a woman here to see you. Says she's your sister, but she doesn't look well. She's pretty upset, and she's making some of our subcontractors uncomfortable in the lobby." I found Claire sitting in one of the client chairs near the reception desk, and the sight of her was genuinely shocking. She had lost at least 15 pounds since I'd last seen her face gaunt and her eyes sunken with dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights and poor nutrition. Her hair, usually styled to perfection, hung limp and unwashed around her shoulders. She was wearing sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt, clothes I'd never seen her in public before, and she clutched a tissue box like a lifeline. "We need to talk," she said without preamble, her voice hoarse from what sounded like days of crying. "Can we go somewhere private?" I led her to the small conference room we used for client meetings, acutely aware of the curious glances from my colleagues. Claire had never visited my workplace before. She'd never shown any interest in my professional life beyond its capacity to generate money for her needs. The fact that she was here now looking desperate and destroyed meant her situation had become truly dire. "Eric broke up with me," she said the moment I closed the door, the words tumbling out in a rush. 3 days after the wedding disaster, he sent me a text message saying he couldn't be associated with family dysfunction anymore. A text message, Stephanie. After 2 years together, after promising to love me forever, he ended our relationship with a text message because the money dried up. She dissolved into fresh tears, and I found myself feeling genuinely sorry for her despite everything that had happened. Whatever else Claire was, she had believed Eric loved her, and discovering his mercenary nature through such cruel abandonment would have been devastating. "I'm sorry, Claire," I said and meant it. "You didn't deserve that." "I don't have anywhere to go," she continued, wiping her nose with a tissue that was already falling apart from overuse. "Eric was paying for my apartment, and he's canceled everything. The lease, the utilities, even my car insurance. I'm staying with Mom and Dad, but they're barely speaking to each other because of all the legal stuff with the police, and Mom cries constantly about how you've ruined everything." The apartment revelation didn't surprise me. Eric's rapid financial abandonment was entirely consistent with his gold digger pattern. But seeing Claire forced to confront the reality of her complete dependence on others was both satisfying and pitiful. "I know what you're thinking," she said, looking at me with an expression that was equal parts defiant and pleading. "You're thinking I got what I deserved. And maybe you're right. But Stephanie, I need you to know that I always knew it wasn't fair." The admission hung in the air between us, the first honest thing she'd said about our family dynamic in years. "I knew Mom treated you differently," she continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I knew she expected you to pay for everything while giving me all the attention and praise. I knew you worked yourself to exhaustion to fund my lifestyle while I contributed nothing. I've always known it was wrong." I waited for the apology, for some expression of remorse or gratitude, but it didn't come. Instead, Claire's next words revealed that her self-awareness came with a twist of self-justification that was breathtaking in its audacity. "But I was scared to be the responsible one," she said, looking at me with eyes that seemed to expect understanding rather than judgment. "You were always so good at handling pressure, so capable of managing everything. It was easier to let you carry all the burden because I knew you could handle it, and I wasn't sure I could. The logic was staggering. She had known our family dynamic was exploitative and unfair, but she had participated anyway because she found it convenient. She had watched me sacrifice my dreams, my relationships, my financial security for her benefit, and had chosen to let it continue because taking responsibility for herself seemed too difficult. "I needed someone to take care of me," she continued, as if this explained everything. "You never seemed to need that kind of support. You were always so independent, so self-sufficient. Mom used to say you were born responsible while I was born to be cherished. It felt like we were just playing our natural roles." I stared at her across the conference table, realizing that even in her moment of complete collapse, Claire still saw herself as the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of her own dependence. She had framed her exploitation of my generosity as fulfilling some cosmic purpose, as if my role as family ATM was a calling rather than a burden. "So what do you want from me, Claire?" I asked. Her face brightened with hope, and I saw a flash of the manipulative charm that had worked on Eric and countless others. "I want us to go back to normal," she said eagerly. "I know you're angry, and you had every right to make your point about the wedding, but now we can start fresh. I've learned my lesson about depending on men like Eric. From now on, it'll just be family supporting family the way it's always been." The audacity of her proposal was stunning. She wanted to resume the exact same dynamic that had driven me to orchestrate her wedding disaster with no changes except the elimination of Eric from the equation. She expected me to forgive years of exploitation and return to funding her lifestyle as if nothing had happened. "I'll be more appreciative this time," she added, apparently interpreting my silence as consideration rather than disbelief. "I'll thank you more often, and I won't take your generosity for granted. But I need you, Stephanie. You're the only family I have left who can take care of me." She wanted forgiveness without change, but I was done being anyone's safety net. Claire's desperate plea for a return to normal was still echoing in my head 3 days later, when the certified letter arrived at my apartment, delivered with the kind of official formality that immediately signals legal trouble. The return address showed the offices of Brennan and Associates, a law firm I'd never heard of, and the thick envelope contained exactly the kind of vindictive surprise I should have expected from Eric, but had foolishly hoped to avoid. The letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation disguised as righteous indignation. Eric's attorney had crafted 3 pages of accusations that painted me as a malicious saboteur who had deliberately destroyed an innocent couple's wedding day through calculated deception and emotional manipulation. According to the legal document, I had committed intentional infliction of emotional distress against both Eric and Claire, causing them severe mental anguish, public humiliation, and substantial financial losses. The damages Eric was demanding were staggering in their audacity, $50,000 for the wedding costs his family had allegedly incurred, an additional $25,000 for reputational harm caused by the viral video, and another $15,000 for what the letter described as therapy and counseling expenses necessitated by defendant's malicious actions. He was essentially asking me to pay him $90,000 for the privilege of having exposed his gold-digging scheme. But it was the specific language of his accusations that revealed just how thoroughly Eric misunderstood both the legal system and my character. The letter claimed I had fraudulently represented my intention to pay for wedding expenses, creating a detrimental reliance that justified financial compensation. His attorney had apparently convinced him that my failure to fund his bride's fairy tale constituted a breach of some imaginary contract. I took the letter directly to Sarah Martinez, the attorney Michael had recommended when the credit card fraud case began. Sarah specialized in both family law and fraud cases, and her reputation for aggressive representation of women in financial disputes had made her something of a local legend. When she finished reading Eric's legal threats, her laughter was so genuine and sustained that I began to relax for the first time since opening the envelope. "This is the most ridiculous lawsuit threat I've seen in 15 years of practice," she said, wiping tears of amusement from her eyes. "Your ex-future brother-in-law has just handed us enough evidence to destroy his credibility in any courtroom in Colorado." Sarah explained that Eric's legal theory was fundamentally flawed because I had never entered into any contract to pay for wedding expenses, never made any legally binding commitments, and had been systematically excluded from the event I was supposedly obligated to fund. But more importantly, his lawsuit threat had opened the door for us to present evidence about his true motives and systematic targeting of financially vulnerable families. The research I had compiled months earlier about Eric's previous engagements suddenly transformed from personal vindication into legal ammunition. Sarah reviewed the documentation about his pattern of targeting women with wealthy siblings, his history of broken engagements following financial difficulties, and his immediate abandonment of Claire when the money disappeared. The evidence painted a clear picture of predatory behavior that would make Eric's claims of victimhood laughable in court. "We have emails showing him probing about your financial situation during your first meeting." Sarah noted, highlighting passages where Eric had asked detailed questions about my income and assets. "We have witness statements from family dinners where he specifically inquired about your generosity toward Claire. This isn't emotional distress. This is a con artist upset that his mark escaped." But Eric's legal intimidation strategy backfired in ways that extended far beyond the courthouse. Apparently believing that public sympathy would strengthen his case, he began posting on social media about his status as an innocent victim of family drama. His Facebook posts described Claire as a beautiful woman caught between her manipulative sister's vindictiveness and her own desire for happiness, while positioning himself as the collateral damage in a toxic family feud. The social media campaign might have worked if Eric hadn't made the crucial mistake of using his real name and including enough personal details for people to identify him. Within 48 hours of his first victim post, his previous fiancés had found his accounts and begun sharing their own experiences with remarkable consistency. Jennifer Walsh, his Phoenix fiancée from 3 years earlier, posted a detailed comment describing Eric's obsession with her family's financial situation and his sudden disappearance when her father's business encountered difficulties. "This man specifically targets women from families with money charms, everyone with his family values talk, then vanishes the moment financial problems appear. Ladies run." Amanda Torres from Seattle added her own story about Eric's calculated courtship, his detailed questions about her family's assets, and his engagement to her younger sister, who came from a family with generous support systems. Her post included screenshots of Eric's dating profile from that period where he had listed family-oriented and traditional values as his primary relationship goals. The local Denver news stations picked up the story when a third woman, Maria Santos, contacted Channel 7 with evidence that Eric had been simultaneously dating multiple women while researching their families' financial backgrounds. Her investigation had uncovered what she described as a systematic pattern of romantic fraud targeting women from families known for supporting their children financially. The Channel 7 report aired on Friday evening with the headline, "Local Man Accused of Serial Gold-Digging Scheme," featuring interviews with all three previous fiancés and expert commentary from a psychologist who specialized in financial predators. The story included footage from Claire's empty wedding, Eric's rapid departure from the scene, and his current lawsuit threats against the sister who had exposed his scheme. Eric's response to the media coverage was predictably defensive and self-defeating. His attorney released a statement claiming that his client was the victim of a coordinated character assassination campaign by bitter former girlfriends, which only served to confirm that there were indeed multiple former girlfriends with similar stories. His own social media posts became increasingly desperate and contradictory, alternating between claims of innocence and attacks on the women who had exposed his pattern. The public relations disaster was complete when the Denver Post ran a weekend feature story about financial predators who target vulnerable families, using Eric's case as a primary example. The article included expert advice for families about recognizing the warning signs of someone who might be more interested in financial access than genuine relationships, with Eric's behavior cited as a textbook example of predatory courtship patterns. He thought he was playing chess, but I'd been collecting his pawns the whole time. Eric's public relations disaster had been so complete that by the time we arrived at the Denver County Courthouse 3 weeks later, his attorney looked like a man who knew he was about to lose badly but was contractually obligated to go through the motions anyway. The preliminary hearing was supposed to be a simple procedural matter, where Eric would present his case for emotional distress damages, but Sarah had transformed it into something much more significant, a public examination of his predatory behavior and my family's systematic financial abuse. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with perhaps 30 seats for observers, but everyone was filled. The viral nature of the wedding disaster had attracted local media attention, and several reporters sat in the front row with notebooks ready. I recognized some faces from my parents' neighborhood and Mom's church people who had followed the story and apparently wanted to witness its legal conclusion in person. Eric arrived late, looking nervous and underdressed in a suit that appeared to be borrowed rather than tailored. His attorney, James Brennan, was a middle-aged man who specialized in personal injury cases and had clearly taken this one without fully understanding what he was walking into. When Sarah began presenting our evidence, his face went through a fascinating progression from confidence to confusion to barely concealed panic. The documentation Sarah had compiled was devastating in its completeness. She presented email threads showing Eric's calculated questions about my financial situation, witness statements from family dinners where he'd probed about my generosity toward Claire, and timeline analysis proving he had researched my family's economic dynamics before proposing marriage. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Patricia Hernandez, listened with growing incredulity as the evidence revealed Eric's systematic targeting of families with financially generous members. "Mr. Jennings," Judge Hernandez said, looking directly at Eric after Sarah finished her presentation. "Are you seriously asking this court to award you damages because someone refused to fund a wedding to which they were not invited for a bride they were not related to by marriage with money they never agreed to provide?" Eric's attorney attempted to salvage the situation by arguing that my family had created reasonable expectations of financial support, but Judge Hernandez cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Counsel, the evidence suggests your client specifically targeted this family because of their history of financial generosity. That's not detrimental reliance, that's predatory behavior." But the most powerful moment of the hearing came when Dad took the witness stand. Sarah had subpoenaed him to testify about the family's financial dynamics, and his appearance in court represented the first time he had ever publicly stood up against Mom's control. He looked older and more fragile than usual in his best suit, but his voice was steady as he swore to tell the truth. "My daughter Stephanie has been financially supporting this family for 10 years, he said, his words carrying across the silent courtroom. "My wife convinced her to give up her scholarship so Claire could attend private college. Stephanie has paid for Claire's car, apartment deposits, cosmetic surgery, and countless other expenses while living in substandard housing and working excessive hours to support us. Dad's testimony grew more damaging as he continued detailing the inheritance theft that had occurred after my grandmother's death. My wife intercepted $50,000 that was specifically left to Stephanie in her grandmother's will. She forged documents and spent the money on family expenses while Stephanie continued sending money home, unaware that there was an inheritance fund being drained for the same purposes. The inheritance revelation caused a visible stir in the courtroom, but Dad wasn't finished. His voice grew stronger as he described Mom's credit card fraud, the systematic identity theft, and his own shameful role in enabling the abuse through silence. "I knew about the fraudulent credit cards," he admitted, looking directly at me with tears in his eyes. "I watched my wife forge my daughter's signature multiple times and said nothing because I was afraid of confrontation. I've been a coward, and my daughter has paid the price for my weakness." Eric's case was effectively destroyed by Dad's testimony, which painted me not as a vindictive sister, but as a long-term victim of family financial abuse, who had finally reached her breaking point. Judge Hernandez listened to every word with an expression that grew increasingly stern, occasionally glancing at Eric with obvious distaste. When Dad finished testifying, Eric's attorney made one last desperate attempt to argue that family dynamics were irrelevant to his client's emotional distress claim. Judge Hernandez's response was swift and decisive. "Mr. Brennan, your client has presented no evidence of actual damages beyond his embarrassment at being exposed as someone who targets women for their family's money. The evidence shows that Mr. Jennings specifically sought out this family because of their history of financial generosity, courted the younger daughter to gain access to the older daughter's resources, and abandoned his fiancée the moment those resources were no longer available." She paused, shuffling through papers with obvious irritation. "This case is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I'm directing the court clerk to forward these proceedings to the district attorney's office for review of potential fraud charges against Mr. Jennings. The pattern of behavior documented here suggests systematic deception for financial gain, which may warrant criminal investigation." The courtroom erupted in whispers as Eric's face went white. His attorney gathered papers with obvious haste, while Eric sat frozen in his chair, apparently stunned that his victim narrative had backfired so completely. The reporters scribbled furiously, recognizing that they had witnessed something more significant than a simple civil case dismissal. As we left the courthouse, Sarah explained that the judge's dismissal with prejudice meant Eric could never refile the same lawsuit, and her referral to the district attorney meant he might face criminal charges for his pattern of romantic fraud. The court records would be public, providing permanent documentation of his predatory behavior that would follow him to any future city or relationship. Justice feels different when you're the one holding the gavel. The legal victory in court provided a satisfying sense of vindication, but the real consequences for my family were only beginning to unfold in the weeks that followed. The wedding vendors who had been left scrambling on Claire's big day were not content to simply write off their losses as bad luck, and their collective pursuit of payment created a cascade of financial disasters that exposed just how precarious my family's situation had become without my regular subsidies. Bella Vista Gardens led the charge, filing a lawsuit in small claims court for the full venue rental fee, plus additional charges for staff time and lost bookings. The florist followed with her own case, seeking payment for the prepared arrangements that had wilted in her cooler while waiting for authorization to deliver. The catering company, which had prepared food for 200 guests before learning the event was canceled, demanded compensation, not just for ingredients, but for lost revenue from other events they had turned away. Even the string quartet, whose members had declined other gigs to hold the date, filed for their contracted performance fee. Each lawsuit was relatively small, individually ranging from $800 to $4,000. But together they created an overwhelming burden for a family that had been living paycheck to paycheck while maintaining the illusion of prosperity through my contributions. Mom and Claire, who had never handled their own legal affairs, were completely unprepared for the systematic nature of the vendors' pursuit and the way that judgments against them would affect their credit ratings and future financial options. The credit destruction was swift and comprehensive. Within 6 weeks of the wedding disaster, both Mom and Claire found themselves with credit scores in the low 400s, effectively eliminating their ability to secure loans, rent apartments, or even open new bank accounts. The vendors' judgments appeared on credit reports as proof of their inability to meet financial obligations, creating a permanent record of the consequences of their assumption that someone else would always cover their expenses. But the financial pressure was only part of their growing isolation. The church congregation where Mom had served as treasurer for over a decade was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that their trusted financial steward had been committing identity theft and credit fraud while managing their charitable funds. The revelation came during Dad's court testimony, which several church members had attended, and within days, the church board had called an emergency meeting to review Mom's handling of their accounts. Pastor Williams, who had known our family for 15 years, made the painful decision to ask Mom to step down from her position after the church's insurance company expressed concerns about liability related to her criminal charges. The removal was handled quietly, but in a congregation of 200 people, nothing stayed secret for long. Mom's sudden absence from her usual duties created speculation that quickly evolved into whispered conversations about financial impropriety and family dysfunction. The social ostracism extended beyond the church into the neighborhood where my parents had lived for 20 years. Mrs. Henderson, who had been Mom's closest friend and walking partner, stopped returning phone calls after the wedding video went viral. The book club Mom had hosted monthly for 8 years found reasons to meet elsewhere. Even the grocery store checkout clerks who had known Mom by name for years suddenly seemed too busy for their usual pleasant conversations. Claire faced her own version of social consequences when she began looking for work after Eric's abandonment left her without financial support. Her attempts to find employment in Denver's competitive marketing field were complicated by the fact that her name had become synonymous with entitled behavior and family drama. Potential employers who Googled her name found articles about the wedding disaster videos of Mom's courthouse breakdown and social media discussions about spoiled family members who expected others to fund their lifestyles. The interview at a downtown advertising agency that should have been routine became humiliating when the hiring manager recognized her name from the news coverage. "Are you the Claire from that viral wedding video?" the woman asked with poorly concealed curiosity. "The one where your sister didn't pay for the wedding." Claire's attempts to explain the situation only made things worse, as her version of events painted her as a victim of family dysfunction, rather than someone taking responsibility for her role in the financial exploitation. But the most devastating revelation came when Dad finally began investigating the extent of Mom's financial deception prompted by the court proceedings and the growing pressure from creditors. What he discovered in her personal papers and credit card statements revealed a pattern of behavior that was far more serious than simple family favoritism or even identity theft. The casino rewards cards he found hidden in Mom's jewelry box told the story of a gambling addiction that had been growing steadily over the past 3 years. The VIP player status she had achieved at 3 different Blackhawk casinos indicated regular visits and substantial losses that she had been funding through a combination of cash advances on fraudulent credit cards and money she claimed was being spent on Claire's needs. The bank statements Dad uncovered showed that significant portions of the money I had been sending home for family expenses had actually been withdrawn in cash during weekend trips to the mountains. The timing of these withdrawals coincided perfectly with Claire's supposed emergencies, creating the illusion that Mom was using my money to help her daughter when she was actually feeding her gambling compulsion while leaving Claire's actual needs to be covered by additional requests for support. The revelation that Mom had been essentially double-dipping, using my money to gamble while claiming she needed even more money for the same family expenses, explained why the family's financial demands had been escalating so dramatically over the past few years. She hadn't been helping Claire at all. She had been using both Claire's needs and my generosity as cover for an addiction that had spiraled completely out of control. Dad's confrontation with Mom about the gambling produced the first genuine fight in their 30-year marriage. a screaming match that their neighbors later described as audible from the street. Mom's defense alternated between denial minimization and blame shifting, but she couldn't explain away the casino records or the pattern of cash withdrawals that corresponded to my transfers. Their house of cards collapsed and everyone could see it was built on my foundation. The desperate family intervention came 6 weeks after the wedding disaster, arriving at my apartment door like a coordinated military operation that had been planned with the same meticulous attention Mom had once devoted to Claire's wedding budget. I was making dinner when the doorbell rang, and through the peephole I could see all 3 of them standing in the hallway, Mom, Dad, and Claire arranged in formation like they were posing for a family portrait of desperation. They had clearly coordinated their appearance for maximum emotional impact. Mom wore the same black dress she'd worn to Grandma's funeral, as if mourning the death of our family relationships. Dad had put on his best suit, the one he wore to job interviews and court appearances, lending gravity to their mission. Claire had chosen a simple sweater and jeans that made her look younger and more vulnerable than her usual carefully curated appearance. Even their timing had been calculated, arriving at dinner time when I would be relaxed and potentially more receptive to their appeals. "We need to talk," Mom said the moment I opened the door, her voice carrying a tremor I'd never heard before. "As a family, about everything that's happened and where we go from here." I stepped aside to let them in, noting how they moved through my apartment with the hesitant caution of people entering foreign territory. They had rarely visited my home during the years when I was funding their lives, preferring to summon me to family dinners where they could control the environment and conversation. Now they were in my space on my terms, and their discomfort was palpable. They arranged themselves on my couch like defendants waiting for sentencing, and the silence that followed felt heavy with the weight of everything that had been destroyed between us. Mom's hands shook as she reached for the tissue box I offered, and I realized with surprise that these were genuine tears, not the performative crying she'd used for years to manipulate my guilt. "We're going to lose the house," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The vendor lawsuits, the lawyer fees, the gambling debts, I can't hide anymore. We've been served with eviction papers, and your father's salary can't cover even our basic expenses without—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would acknowledge my role as their financial foundation. Dad looked like he had aged a decade in the past 2 months. His shoulders curved inward with defeat, and his eyes holding the exhausted expression of someone who had finally run out of ways to avoid difficult truths. "The gambling addiction counselor says your mother needs intensive treatment," he said, his voice hoarse from shame. "The insurance will cover some of it, but there are costs, and with everything else falling apart, I don't know how we're going to manage." Claire's admission was the most honest thing I'd ever heard from her. "I don't know how to function without someone taking care of me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I've never had to budget or manage bills or make actual adult decisions because you always handled everything. I'm 26 years old and I don't know how to live like a normal person because I've never had to learn." The desperation in her voice was raw and genuine, stripped of the entitled demands that had characterized our interactions for years. She wasn't asking for money or trying to manipulate my emotions. She was simply stating a fact about her complete lack of life skills that was both pathetic and honest. "The neighbors won't speak to us," Mom continued, wiping her nose with a tissue that was already falling apart from overuse. "Mrs. Henderson crossed the street yesterday to avoid walking past me. The church has asked us to find another congregation. People I've known for 20 years look at me like I'm a criminal, and I suppose they're right to do that because that's what I am." Her acknowledgement of her criminal behavior surprised me more than anything else she could have said. For the first time in my memory, Mom was taking responsibility for her actions without immediately shifting blame or making excuses. The weight of public humiliation and legal consequences had apparently broken through decades of self-justification and forced her to confront the reality of what she had done. "We're not asking you to fix everything," Dad said, though the hope in his eyes suggested that was exactly what they were hoping for. "We know we've burned that bridge, but we need help figuring out how to start over, how to build a life that doesn't depend on taking advantage of your generosity." I listened to their pleas and confessions with a calmness that surprised me. 6 months earlier, seeing them in this much distress would have sent me into immediate problem-solving mode, calculating how much money I could spare and what sacrifices I could make to ease their suffering. But sitting in my own living room, surrounded by the evidence of the life I'd built for myself, my books, my art supplies from the drafting class, I'd finally taken photos from my Hawaii trip, I felt only a distant sadness for the family we might have been if different choices had been made years earlier. "I'm sorry you're going through this," I said, and I meant it genuinely. "I can see that you're all in real pain, and I don't take any pleasure in watching you suffer." Their faces brightened with hope, interpreting my compassion as the first step toward reconciliation and renewed financial support. But I wasn't finished speaking. "However, I'm not responsible for fixing the consequences of choices that were made without consulting me. Mom's gambling addiction, Claire's financial dependence, the pattern of taking my money while committing fraud in my name. These are problems that existed long before the wedding, and they're not problems I created or problems I can solve." The hope faded from their expressions as they realized I wasn't going to resume my role as their financial safety net. Mom opened her mouth to argue, probably to deploy the familiar guilt tactics that had worked for so many years, but something in my expression stopped her. "I've learned to set boundaries." I continued, my voice steady and clear. "I'll help you find resources for gambling addiction treatment. I'll provide contact information for financial counselors and social services that can help with housing assistance. But I won't be writing checks to make this problem disappear because that's what created this mess in the first place." They wanted their ATM back, but I'd close that account forever. The 3 weeks that followed their desperate intervention were the most challenging of our entire family relationship, not because of conflict or drama, but because we were all learning to navigate completely unfamiliar territory. For the first time in a decade, I was offering help without enabling dysfunction, and they were being forced to accept assistance that came with accountability rather than unconditional support. Mom's gambling treatment became the first test of our new dynamic. After researching addiction programs in the Denver area, I found Mountain View Recovery Center, a facility that specialized in gambling addiction, with a structured outpatient program that included individual therapy, group counseling, and financial planning education. When I called to inquire about costs, I was clear with the intake coordinator that I would be paying directly and wanted to receive progress reports as an authorized family member. "I'm not giving you money for treatment," I told Mom during a follow-up phone call after she'd completed her initial assessment. "I'm paying the facility directly for your program, and I'll be receiving monthly reports on your attendance and participation. If you miss sessions or don't engage with the process, the funding stops immediately." The arrangement stripped away Mom's ability to use treatment money for other purposes, something I wouldn't have thought to worry about 6 months earlier, but now recognized as a necessary precaution. Her response to these conditions revealed how much she was still struggling to accept the new reality of our relationship. She alternated between gratitude for my willingness to help and resentment about the lack of trust my conditions implied. Dad's situation required different boundaries but equally clear structure. He had been forced to take early retirement from the hardware store when the stress of the legal proceedings and family scandal began, affecting his work performance, leaving him with a small pension that barely covered their mortgage payment. I agreed to cover utilities and basic living expenses for 6 months, but only after he provided me with complete access to their household budget and bank statements. "Every expense over $50 needs to be discussed with me first," I explained during our monthly financial review meeting at my apartment. "I need to see receipts, understand what money is being spent on, and have assurance that my contributions aren't enabling any continuation of the gambling or financial deception." The transparency requirement was humiliating for Dad, who had never had to account for his spending to anyone, but it was also educational. As we went through their monthly expenses together, he began to understand how completely their lifestyle had been subsidized by my contributions over the years. Grocery bills, gas money, entertainment expenses, home maintenance costs, nearly every category of spending had been inflated by the assumption that I would cover any shortfalls. Claire's recovery process proved the most complex because it required her to develop skills she had never needed to learn. After researching career development programs, I found a 6-month office management certification course at a local community college that included internship placement and job search support. The program cost $3,000, which I paid directly to the school, with the understanding that Claire would need to maintain a B average and provide me with monthly progress reports. Her initial resistance to the accountability measures was predictable but instructive. "Why can't you just trust that I'll do well?" she asked during our first check-in meeting. "I'm not Mom, I don't have a gambling problem. I just need some support while I get back on my feet." "Because trust is earned through consistent actions over time," I replied. "For 10 years you've made commitments about becoming more independent and self-sufficient, but those commitments were always abandoned the moment something easier became available. I'm not funding another round of good intentions." The evidence of her struggle to adapt to responsibility showed up in small but significant ways. Her first month's progress report revealed that she had missed 3 classes due to what she described as personal emergencies, oversleeping car trouble, and a minor illness that she claimed made attendance impossible. Her academic performance was acceptable but not exceptional, suggesting she was doing the minimum required work rather than fully engaging with the material. But there were also signs of genuine growth. When she called to ask for money to fix her car's transmission, she accepted my referral to a financial counselor who could help her explore payment plans and used car options instead of demanding immediate financial rescue. When she mentioned struggling with her coursework, she took my suggestion to utilize the college's tutoring services rather than asking me to hire a private tutor. The monthly family dinners I eventually agreed to resume were perhaps the most visible evidence of how fundamentally our relationships had changed. These gatherings, held at a neutral restaurant, rather than the family home, operated under strict guidelines about conversation topics and financial discussions. Any mention of money requests for assistance or attempts to guilt me into resuming old patterns would result in my immediate departure. "This feels so formal," Claire complained during our 3rd dinner together. "We used to be able to talk about anything as a family. Now it's like we're following a script." "We used to talk about my money and your needs," I corrected. "That wasn't family conversation, that was business negotiation disguised as emotional connection. If you want to talk about your job training, your therapy progress, or Dad's volunteer work, I'm genuinely interested. But I'm not interested in resuming conversations about what I can do for you financially." The most meaningful change was visible in Dad, who began attending Al-Anon meetings to learn about supporting someone in addiction recovery, while also examining his own patterns of enabling behavior. His participation in the program was voluntary and self-directed, the first time I could remember him taking initiative on any family issue, rather than simply reacting to Mom's decisions. "I'm learning that I've been afraid of conflict my whole married life," he told me during one of our budget meetings. "I enabled your mother's gambling and financial abuse because confronting her felt scarier than watching her hurt you. The Al-Anon program is helping me understand that my silence was its own form of dysfunction." These conversations with Dad were painful but necessary, creating space for him to acknowledge his role in the family's toxic dynamics while demonstrating his commitment to actual change rather than just apologizing for past behavior. His willingness to examine his own failures gave me hope that our relationship might eventually evolve beyond financial transactions and crisis management. Love doesn't mean being someone's personal bank account. It means helping them learn to manage their own. With the new boundaries firmly established and my family's crises no longer consuming every spare moment of mental energy, I discovered something remarkable: I had bandwidth for professional ambition that had been dormant for years. The constant interruptions from family emergencies had ended the stress-induced insomnia that had plagued me for months, finally lifted, and for the first time since college, I could focus entirely on my career without wondering when the next financial crisis would derail my concentration. The promotion to senior project manager came 6 months after the wedding disaster following the successful completion of the Riverside Commons renovation that had introduced me to Michael. My supervisor, Janet Martinez, called me into her office on a Friday afternoon with a smile that immediately told me the news was good. Morrison Construction is expanding into commercial development, and we need someone to head up the new division," she said, sliding a folder across her desk. "Your work on Riverside demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and attention to detail we need. The position comes with a 40% salary increase, your own team of project coordinators, and the opportunity to bid on some of the largest development projects in Colorado." The salary increase alone was more money than I had ever imagined earning, but what excited me most was the creative challenge of the new role. Instead of managing renovations of existing structures, I would be involved in planning and executing completely new commercial developments from the ground up. The position would require me to work closely with architects, city planners, and environmental specialists, exactly the kind of collaborative, creative work I had dreamed about during my abandoned architecture aspirations. My first major project as senior manager was a mixed-use development in downtown Boulder, combining retail space, office buildings, and residential units in a design that prioritized sustainable building practices and community integration. The project required weekly meetings with the architectural firm, where I found myself contributing ideas about space utilization and structural efficiency that drew on both my construction experience and my long-suppressed design interests. "You should have been an architect," commented Rebecca Chen, the lead architect on the project, after I suggested modifications to the building's orientation that would maximize natural light while minimizing energy costs. "Your understanding of how space affects people's daily experience is remarkable for someone with a construction background." Her observation sparked something I hadn't felt in years: professional pride that was entirely separate from my ability to solve other people's problems. For the first time since college, someone was recognizing my intellectual contributions rather than my financial resources, and the validation was intoxicating. Meanwhile, my relationship with Michael was evolving in ways that constantly surprised me with their healthiness. He had never asked about my family drama beyond expressing concern for my well-being, never probed about my financial situation, and never seemed to expect anything from me beyond genuine companionship and emotional availability. Learning to receive this kind of uncomplicated affection was like learning a foreign language familiar enough to recognize, but requiring conscious effort to understand and respond appropriately. Our dates were simple and focused on shared interests, rather than expensive experiences designed to impress. We spent Saturday mornings at farmers' markets discussing sustainable building practices and organic farming techniques. We hiked mountain trails together, talking about architecture and environmental design while enjoying Colorado's natural beauty. We cooked dinner together at his apartment, experimenting with recipes and laughing at our kitchen failures without any underlying tension about who was paying for groceries or whose turn it was to contribute financially. The evening he proposed was so perfectly aligned with who I was becoming that it left me speechless in the best possible way. Instead of an expensive restaurant or elaborate public display, Michael invited me to his apartment for what I assumed was our usual Saturday evening together. When I arrived, he had cleared his dining room table and covered it with architectural drawings that took my breath away. "I've been working on these for 3 months," he said, his voice nervous but excited. "They're plans for a house we could build together if you're interested in that kind of future." The drawings showed a 2-story home with large windows and open floor plan that maximized natural light and a home office space that could serve as a design studio. The kitchen opened onto a garden area where we could grow our own vegetables. The master bedroom had a reading nook with built-in shelves for the books we both loved. Every detail reflected conversations we'd had about our preferences, dreams, and values. "The lot I have in mind is about 20 minutes from both our offices," he continued, pulling out a survey map. "It's got mature trees and a small creek, perfect for the kind of sustainable design we've talked about. We could incorporate solar panels, rainwater collection, maybe even a small workshop space for your drafting projects." Instead of a diamond ring, he offered me a T-square and a set of professional drafting pencils in a wooden case. "I thought maybe you'd like to collaborate on finalizing the design," he said. "Make it truly ours instead of something one person planned for the other." The proposal was so thoughtful, so focused on building something together rather than him providing something for me that I started crying before I could answer. These were happy tears, the kind I had rarely experienced in my adult life, born from the overwhelming realization that someone wanted to create a future with me based on partnership rather than financial utility. But perhaps the most significant change in my life was the expansion of my social circle beyond family obligations and work relationships. With my evenings and weekends no longer consumed by family crises, I had time and energy to invest in friendships that were based on mutual interests and genuine affection rather than need and obligation. My friendship with Sarah Kim. A graphic designer I met in the evening drafting class, Michael had encouraged me to grew from shared frustration with perspective, drawing techniques to regular coffee dates where we discussed art design and our experiences as women in male-dominated professional fields. Sarah introduced me to her book club, a group of 8 women who met monthly to discuss novels and share wine, creating the kind of female friendship network I had never had time to develop. The book club led to other activities: weekend art museum visits, hiking groups, cooking classes, where we learned to make pasta from scratch and laughed about our varying degrees of success. These women knew nothing about my family drama and weren't interested in my financial situation beyond the casual concern friends show for each other's general well-being. They valued my opinions about literature, enjoyed my dry sense of humor, and appreciated my willingness to drive when we planned group outings. For the first time in my adult life, I was living for me, and it felt incredible. The incredible feeling of living authentically was still settling into my bones when I found myself facing an unexpected urge that caught me off guard during a quiet Sunday morning in the partially constructed house Michael and I were building together. We had been staying in the guest bedroom while the main construction was completed, and I was sitting in what would eventually become my home office, surrounded by the smell of fresh lumber and the distant sound of Michael making breakfast in the temporary kitchen setup. Something about the peaceful domesticity of the moment, combined with the physical evidence of the new life I was creating, triggered an overwhelming need to process everything that had brought me to this point. Not through conversation or therapy or family meetings, but through the solitary act of writing down every single emotion I had carried but never expressed during those 10 years of financial servitude. I found myself reaching for a legal pad from my work supplies and beginning what would become the longest piece of personal writing I had ever attempted. The letter started as a straightforward account addressed to my family, but it quickly evolved into something much more complex, a comprehensive inventory of every resentment, every moment of hurt, every instance of feeling invisible that I had accumulated over the past decade. The words poured out with startling intensity as if a dam had burst somewhere deep inside my psyche. I wrote about the 18-year-old girl who had given up her architecture scholarship and how that sacrifice had been treated as so unremarkable that no one ever mentioned it again. I documented the cascade of financial demands that had followed, each one presented as temporary and urgent, but which collectively had consumed my entire adult life until I existed primarily as a problem-solving resource, rather than a person with desires and dreams. I wrote about the loneliness of working 70-hour weeks while my family enjoyed the lifestyle my labor provided, about watching Claire post social media photos of vacations and shopping trips funded by my overtime pay while I ate microwave dinners in my studio apartment. I described the specific pain of being excluded from the wedding I was expected to fund, the casual cruelty of being treated as too important to lose, but not important enough to include. The letter grew to encompass memories I had forgotten I was carrying, childhood instances of being told I was the responsible one, when what I heard was the useful one. Teenage years when my accomplishments were celebrated primarily for their potential to benefit Claire's future college years, when my academic success was constantly reframed in terms of what it could provide for the family, rather than what it meant for my personal growth. As I wrote, I found myself exploring emotions I had never allowed myself to fully experience. The anger was there, certainly, but underneath it was a profound sadness about the family relationships I had thought I was nurturing through my financial generosity. I grieved for the sister relationship Claire and I might have had if it hadn't been built on economic dependency for the respect I might have earned from Mom, if I hadn't been so readily available to solve her problems with money for the conversations Dad and I might have shared, if he hadn't been so focused on avoiding conflict that he never really saw me as a person worth protecting. The writing process stretched across 3 days with sessions that lasted hours as I worked through layers of suppressed feelings that seemed to have been waiting decades for acknowledgement. I wrote about the specific humiliation of being discussed like a financial instrument during family planning sessions, about the exhaustion of being constantly alert for the next crisis that would require my intervention, about the way I had gradually lost touch with my own preferences and desires because they had seemed irrelevant compared to everyone else's needs. I documented the pattern of manipulation I had been too close to, see clearly how family conversations were structured to make me feel guilty for having money, while they struggled how my successes were consistently reframed as obligations rather than achievements, how my relationships and personal time were treated as expendable resources that should be sacrificed whenever family needs arose. But I also wrote about my own complicity in the dynamic, acknowledging how my desperate need for family approval had made me an eager participant in my own exploitation. I explored my tendency to equate love with financial utility, my fear of setting boundaries that might result in rejection, my assumption that being needed was the same as being valued. The letter became a comprehensive examination of how family dysfunction had shaped my understanding of relationships and self-worth in ways I was only beginning to recognize and correct. When I finally reached the end of what felt like an exhaustive emotional inventory, I had filled nearly 40 pages with handwriting that grew increasingly loose and urgent as suppressed feelings found their way onto paper. The letter was raw, honest, and completely devastating in its catalog of accumulated hurt and resentment. Reading through it, I felt both drained and oddly liberated, as if I had finally given voice to a part of myself that had been silenced for years. But as I sat in my future office holding this comprehensive document of family pain and personal growth, I realized something surprising. I didn't want to send it. The letter had served its purpose through the writing process alone, providing a structured way to examine and release emotions I hadn't even known I was carrying. Sending it would shift the focus from my own healing to their reactions, from internal closure to external validation. The decision not to send the letter felt like the final step in claiming full ownership of my emotional experience. For years I had looked to my family for acknowledgement of my worth, for appreciation of my sacrifices, for recognition of my humanity beyond my utility. But sitting in the house I was building with someone who loved me for who I was rather than what I could provide, I understood that their acknowledgement was no longer necessary for my healing. That evening, Michael and I built our first fire in the stone fireplace we had designed together, using scraps of lumber from the construction process. As the flames caught and grew, I fed the letter page by page into the fire, watching decades of resentment transform into smoke that rose through the chimney and disappeared into the Colorado sky. The symbolic release was more powerful than I had expected, each burning page representing another piece of emotional baggage I was choosing to leave behind. The smoke carried away not just my anger and hurt, but also my need for my family's understanding, my requirement for their apology, my dependence on their validation for my sense of self-worth. Michael sat beside me on the hearth, not asking about what I was burning, but somehow understanding the significance of the moment. As the last page curled into ash, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced since childhood, a sense of completion that came from honoring my own emotional experience without needing anyone else's permission or participation. Some conversations happen within yourself, and those are the ones that matter most. And that thought stayed with me as the jet's wheels kissed the runway a year later, and the cabin applauded out of habit, the kind of small ritual that used to irritate me because it felt performative, but now simply made me smile because even strangers have their ways of marking arrivals. This time, I had come back to Hawaii not to vanish, but to be seen, and Michael squeezed my hand as we waited for our bags, a quiet, steady pressure that said we had nothing to outrun, only something to walk toward. The air outside the terminal was warm and salted, the way I remembered trade winds lifting the ends of my hair and bringing with them a scent of plumeria and sunscreen and grilled pineapple. And I thought of the last time I was here with my phone inverted on a beach chair counting the staccato climb of missed calls like hail hitting a roof. Today my phone was on face-up soft with notifications from airline apps and a single text from my father. "Hope your flight was smooth, kiddo. Send a picture when you can." And I laughed because we had arrived at a future in which asking for a picture was all he wanted from me. Checks and transfers and apologies and excuses had fallen out of our vocabulary, and we were learning new words at last, small and ordinary and mercifully light. Later, when the concierge slid a key card across the marble desk and congratulated us on our engagement, Michael bent close and whispered, "So this is what it feels like to begin again," and I told him it felt like standing on a dock at dawn with the whole day opening like a clean page. We walked the familiar footpath down to the same stretch of sand where I had once hidden the water, a clear, forgiving blue that didn't care who I had been or what I'd carried. And as we set our bag by a pair of loungers and spread out towels, he knelt. Not to propose again. We had done that under the oak behind my apartment when the leaves were the color of copper pennies. But to draw a ring in the sand, a simple circle around our bare feet, and he said, "There now we're inside our own promises," and we laughed because the gesture was playful and so unlike the ceremonies I used to bankroll for other people's comfort. People nearby were doing beach things. Children racing crabs, retirees in broad-brimmed hats, reading novels a couple in matching shirts, practicing a hula step in the shallows, and the ordinariness of it felt holy after the thunder years. I sat and let the sunlight find my shoulders, and thought without flinching. About home, Mom had joined a gambling recovery group 8 months ago after the detective's stern talk and the church committee's final vote, and she stayed. Twice a week, she sits in a circle in the basement of an old community center with folding chairs and a stale coffee urn, and she says her name and tells the truth about the itch in her fingers and the way the room used to tilt when she thought of jackpots. She also rings up groceries at a neighborhood market 2 towns over, where no one knows her maiden name brings home dented cans with discounted stickers and recipes that make sense on a paycheck. And when she calls me now, she talks about customers and the rhythm of scanning barcodes and how tired feet can be a thank you when money is honest, and she never once asks for my card. Claire, who once measured success in bouquets and guest counts, works an entry-level desk near a humming copier and a window that faces an alley with a mural of koi fish, and she texts me photos of her budget spreadsheets with a proud little caption like, "Look at me, sister." I found $50 that didn't need to be spent. She started a savings jar with quarters because the sound of them clinking into glass makes diligence feel tangible. And sometimes she calls after work to catalog small victories, resisting a sale on shoes or cooking beans instead of ordering something fast and empty. And when she tells me she is learning the difference between pretty and true, I tell her that is graduate-level wisdom. My father, who spent years in a chair watching storms pass, sets up folding tables now at a public library on Tuesday evenings, and volunteers for a financial literacy class for adults, demonstrating how compound interest grows and how predatory lenders hide fees in foggy print. He likes the paper smell of borrowed books, the hush of study, the way the participants swap stories about second chances. And sometimes he closes the session with a joke about late fees, and when he calls me afterward, his voice is brighter than I remember from my childhood, like a porch light left on for someone who finally arrived. Thinking of them no longer snags something sore in me. It lands gently, like a bird that knows it will not be trapped, and I am not keeping score or writing invoices in my head. I am sitting on warm sand, watching the tide revise the shoreline, as if one great eraser were passing quietly over everything that tried to fix me to the past. Michael read for a while, and then dozed, and I listened to the measured rush of the waves, and considered the word duty. How heavy it had been when I wore it like a yoke, and how ordinary it felt now that I'd sorted what belonged to me from what did not. I thought about the difference between obligation and care, the first a leash and the second a choice, and how long it took me to learn that loving someone is not the same as becoming their spare battery. I could love my mother's effort without underwriting her relapse, love my sister's budgeting without becoming her emergency fund love. My father's volunteer pride without stepping behind his table to teach. I could love Michael without promising him the impossible, and he could love me without asking me to shrink. My phone buzzed and lit up with Mom's name, and I didn't jump. I didn't feel the belt tighten around my ribcage the way it once did. I watched the call ring, and then stop, and then a voicemail icon bloom like a small fruit, and I waited until a gull had walked the length of our umbrella's shadow and back before I lifted the phone and pressed play. Her voice was hesitant, but calm. She wanted to know if the sea looked like the postcard we had on the fridge when I was a child, the one with a hibiscus and a strip of white sand. She said she'd learned how to make a fruit salad for the store's Saturday samples, and that she was getting good at scissoring coupons without thinking of slot machines. She said she hoped I was resting and that there was no rush to call back because she was on her way to a meeting and she would talk to me when I had time. I put the phone down and closed my eyes and felt the complicated gratitude you feel when someone you love who hurt you learns to be someone who doesn't hurt you, not by grand gestures but by the daily unspectacular labor of being decent. Later, we walked to the water and let it take our ankles, then our shins, and Michael asked if I wanted a photo to send my dad, and I said yes. And we stood with our faces turned toward the horizon, not staged, just available to the light, and he snapped one where I'm laughing and not thinking about how laughter looks. When we came back to the towels, I called Dad, and he answered on the second ring and asked about the clouds and whether the trades were up. The kind of small talk that sounds like nothing but, to me, contains everything. And after we hung up, I texted the photo to Mom and Claire, too, and put the phone back down without waiting for replies. The afternoon steeped toward gold and shadows lengthened like friendly, unthreatening hands, and I thought about that last conversation in myself a year ago, and how it had become less of a verdict and more of a compass, because it wasn't a door slammed or a speech delivered into a void. It was a steady retraining of instinct toward peace. A child nearby shrieked with delighted outrage as a wave stole her plastic shovel, and then returned it, and everyone on that little patch of beach laughed. A brief communion of strangers, and I felt something loosen in me that had nothing to do with victory, and everything to do with relief, the kind that leaves after it has made sure you can stand up without it. I drew my own circle in the sand with my toe and then stepped out of it and watched a new line form at the edge of the water, a soft claim that would not last, and I knew that was the point. We gathered our things when the sun began to lower and the wind changed, and as we walked along the wet sand, my footprints filled one by one until no one could tell I had been there. I realized suddenly and without drama that this was the truest ending I could have hoped for, the kind that opens into a beginning. The waves washed away my footprints just like I'd washed away their hold on me, and for the first time in 28 years I was truly free. And if you're standing where I once stood listening to the surf of your own life erase what hurt you, I want you to know something simple and solid. You are not late, you are not broken, and you are not obligated to carry what taught you to bend. Healing isn't a single grand gesture. It's a string of small mercies you offer yourself one ordinary day at a time. Start with breath slow, counted, honest. Name what happened without decorating it, and then name what you need. Rest, distance, boundaries help. None of that is selfish. It's maintenance, like mending a favorite sweater so it can keep you warm. When the ache flares, remember there are gentle tools within reach. Some people journal in the quiet of morning, letting the pen drain the noise so the day can begin. Others talk to a therapist who keeps a steady lamp on the path. If that feels daunting, begin with a support group at a community center or church basement where stories loosen the knots shame tries to tie. Walks help familiar sidewalks or a nearby trail where you can hear leaves, not opinions. A mindfulness app can guide you to notice your shoulders dropping your jaw, unclenching your heartbeat, choosing a calmer drum. If money is tangled up in your pain, a free financial literacy class can turn fear into numbers you can manage. If your phone is a door people used to barge through, change the lock, silence threads set. Do not disturb, answer when you are ready. You are allowed to be reachable without being available. Some days you'll feel strong. Some days you will simply feel. On those days, make your world smaller and kinder, a warm drink in a real mug, a tidy corner, a call to the friend who listens more than she advises. Keep a list titled, Things That Help. When I forget what helps, short, practical yours. Eat, sleep, drink water. Step into sunlight for 10 honest minutes. Celebrate unremarkable victories. A bill paid, a boundary kept. A thought you let pass without chasing it. That's how peace grows quietly, stubbornly, like beach grass that learns the shape of wind and still holds the dune. If family is part of your healing, let love be a bridge, not a leash. Give what you mean and only what you mean. Let people meet you where you live now, not where they left you. And when old guilt knocks, ask it to speak plainly. What do you want from me that I cannot give without losing myself? Then choose yourself gently again. I don't know what your ocean looks like. Maybe it's a lake, a kitchen table, a sunrise glimpsed through blinds, but I know you deserve a life that fits. If this story kept you company, if you found a word that felt like a hand to hold, I'd be grateful to have you stay close. You can follow along here so the next time we talk about boundaries or courage or the quiet art of starting over, you won't have to look for me. I'll be here, and so will you.